The storm had come without warning, a beast of wind and water that thrashed against the main coastline with unrelenting fury. Lightning cracked across the sky, illuminating the churning waters of the Atlantic for brief, terrifying moments before plunging back into darkness. Rain pelted horizontally, stinging like needles against exposed skin. It was the kind of night when sensible people stayed on land, doors locked, windows shuttered against nature's wrath. But the fishermen of Port Haven were rarely afforded such luxuries. The emergency siren wailed through the night, its mournful cry cutting through the howling wind. In a cliffside house overlooking the harbor, Griffin Mercer jolted awake, his powerful frame tensing before his eyes had fully opened. The phone on his nightstand was already ringing. He knew what it meant before he answered. "Mercer," he said, his deep voice betraying no trace of sleep, despite the clock reading 2:17 a.m. "Mr. Mercer, it's the Northern Star," came the urgent voice of the harbor master. "She's taking on water about 3 miles offshore. Captain reports engine failure and partial hull breach. Coast Guard's been notified, but they're an hour out from our position due to rescue operations down in Rockport." Griffin was already moving, pulling on clothes with practiced efficiency. "Ready my vessel. Full crew. We launch in 10. At 38, Griffin Mercer stood 6'7", with shoulders broad enough to fill doorways and hands that could crush lesser men's with a simple handshake. His salt and pepper hair was cropped short military style, framing a face weathered by years at sea and hardened by loss. Steel-gray eyes that rarely warmed with humor scanned the darkness as he drove toward the harbor, his truck cutting through sheets of rain. Port Haven existed because of the sea, and sometimes died because of it too. Griffin knew this truth in his bones. He'd felt its cost personally, had paid its price in grief. Now he commanded the largest shipping operation on the eastern seaboard, built from the remnants of his father's modest fleet. His word was law in Port Haven, his approval necessary for any business that hoped to thrive. Not through threats or intimidation, but through the simple reality that Mercer Shipping employed half the town and influenced the commerce that sustained the other half. The harbor was chaos when he arrived, controlled chaos, but chaos nonetheless. His rescue vessel, the Redemption, was already being prepared, floodlights illuminating the deck where crew members moved with urgent purpose. No one questioned his presence or his authority as he boarded, even though legally the Coast Guard should handle all rescue operations. In Port Haven, when lives were at stake, you didn't wait for protocol. "Status," Griffin demanded, as he stepped onto the bridge water streaming from his rain jacket. "Northern Star reports 5 crew members' vessel taking on water faster than they can pump. Captain Reynolds says they've got maybe 30 minutes before they'll need to abandon ship," replied his first mate, a weathered man named Hank, who'd served with Griffin's father decades earlier. Griffin nodded once, eyes already on the radar. "Get us moving. Notify medical. We might have hypothermia cases." The Redemption pushed through waves that would have capsized lesser vessels. Griffin stood at the helm, his massive frame braced against the violent pitching eyes, fixed on the horizon, where occasional flashes of the distress beacon penetrated the darkness. His face betrayed nothing but his mind calculated distances, time's survival probabilities. 23 minutes later, they reached the struggling fishing vessel. The Northern Star listed dangerously to port waves washing over her deck. Griffin directed the rescue operation with the precision of a battlefield commander. His voice cutting through the storm when necessary, his hand signals clear and decisive when words would be lost to the wind. One by one, the 5 fishermen were brought aboard the Redemption. The last man, Captain Reynolds, refused to leave until Griffin himself extended a hand from the rescue vessel. "She's gone, Captain!" Griffin shouted over the howling wind. "Nothing more you can do." The older man hesitated, decades of pride and responsibility warring with reality, before finally grasping Griffin's outstretched hand. With strength that belied his executive status, Griffin hauled the captain aboard just as a massive wave crashed over the Northern Star's deck. The rescue complete, Griffin ordered their return to Port Haven. As they pulled away, lightning struck again, illuminating the sinking vessel. Something caught Griffin's eye, a piece of debris floating nearby, different from the other wreckage. He ordered one of the crew to retrieve it with a grappling hook. When the waterlogged piece of wood was brought aboard, Griffin felt his blood run cold. Despite the darkness and the rain, there was no mistaking the carved symbol partially visible on its surface. A trident, the same emblem that had adorned the vessel his father had captained, the vessel that had sunk 25 years ago, taking his father and 16 others to their graves. The trident, a ship that should have been nothing but rotted timbers hundreds of feet below the surface, miles from this location. Griffin's face remained impassive as he casually took the wood piece from the crewman's hands. "I'll see this gets to the harbor master for the incident report," he said, his tone giving nothing away. But as he slipped the waterlogged wood inside his jacket close to his chest, his eyes held something rarely seen there: fear. 1 week after the rescue of the Northern Star's crew, Port Haven had returned to its usual rhythms. Fishing vessels came and went with the tides. Mercer Shipping's container operations continued their clockwork efficiency. The storm had passed, leaving behind only minor damage to the harbor infrastructure and the somber news that the Northern Star had been declared unsalvageable. Yet Griffin Mercer remained unsettled. The piece of wood from the trident now lay hidden in his home office, safe, a mystery he had shared with no one. Each night since the rescue, he'd examined it under bright light fingers, tracing the carved symbol that had once been his father's proud mark. It was impossible. The trident had gone down in a storm 25 years ago, nearly 30 miles southwest of where they'd found this debris. The official report had been clear vessel lost due to catastrophic hull failure during unprecedented storm conditions. No survivors, no significant wreckage ever recovered. So why had a piece appeared now, after all these years, in nearly pristine condition? Griffin's contemplation was interrupted by his executive assistant, Mei Zhao, knocking on his office door. "Mr. Mercer," she said, her voice carrying the slight accent of her Shanghai upbringing, "Dorothy Sullivan has finalized the sale of Harborview Inn." Griffin looked up sharply. "To whom we haven't received any purchase applications through the Town Development Committee." May shifted uncomfortably. In her 3 years working for Griffin, she'd learned to recognize the dangerous quietness that preceded his rare displays of temper. "That's just it, sir. She sold to an outside buyer. The paperwork was filed directly with the county clerk this morning, bypassing the local approval process entirely." Griffin's jaw tightened. Harborview Inn was Port Haven's oldest accommodation, a historic 3-story Victorian overlooking the harbor that had housed visitors for over a century. Dorothy Sullivan, now in her late 70s, had run it for decades, but rumors of her retirement had circulated for years. "Who's the buyer?" he asked, his tone measured. "A woman named Abigail Winters, former investment director at Coburn Financial in Boston. The sale was all cash, no contingencies, 15% above asking price." Griffin stood his 6'7" frame, making even his spacious office feel suddenly small. "Find everything you can about Ms. Winters. Financial records, business history, personal background, and schedule a meeting with Dorothy this afternoon." As May left to carry out his instructions, Griffin turned to the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a commanding view of Port Haven's harbor. From this vantage point, he could see the white-painted facade of Harborview Inn on the opposite shore, its distinctive widow's walk silhouetted against the blue sky. In 20 years of building his shipping empire, Griffin had established certain unwritten rules in Port Haven. Chief among them, major property transactions and business ventures required his tacit approval. Not because of any official authority, but because his practical influence touched every aspect of the town's economy. It wasn't control for control's sake. It was about maintaining stability, predictability, safety. The appearance of a piece from his father's lost ship, and now this unauthorized sale. Two disruptions to the careful order he'd established within days of each other. Griffin didn't believe in coincidences. "Ms. Sullivan is expecting you," announced Dorothy's longtime housekeeper when Griffin arrived at her private residence that afternoon. The elderly woman had moved to a smaller cottage near the lighthouse after her husband's passing 5 years earlier, maintaining only a managerial presence at the inn. Dorothy sat in a sunroom overlooking the Atlantic, a delicate teacup in her gnarled hands. At 78, she remained sharp-minded despite her physical frailty. Her white hair elegantly coiffed, her posture perfect. She'd been the first person to offer teenage Griffin a job after his mother's death, and despite their occasional disagreements, a mutual respect had developed over the decades. "I wondered how long it would take you to appear on my doorstep," she said, without preamble, a hint of amusement in her faded blue eyes. Griffin remained standing, too restless to sit. "Why didn't you come to me first, Dorothy? You know I would have paid a fair price for the property." "And do what with it, Griffin? Turn it into another office for Mercer Shipping, or perhaps let it sit empty while you decided its fate?" She set down her teacup with deliberate care. "The inn needs someone with vision, someone who'll honor its history while bringing it into the future. And this Abigail Winters has this vision." Griffin couldn't keep the skepticism from his voice. Dorothy's eyes sharpened. "She does. More importantly, she has passion, intelligence, and her own resources. She won't be beholden to you or anyone else in Port Haven. That's precisely what the town needs: new blood, independent voices." Griffin's expression darkened. "This town has prospered under my guidance, Dorothy." "It has survived, Griffin. There's a difference." She softened her tone. "You've done well by Port Haven, better than most would have. But one man's vision, no matter how well-intentioned, eventually becomes a constraint. Abigail Winters represents something this town desperately needs: possibility." Griffin said nothing, his jaw set in a hard line. Dorothy sighed. "She's renovating the inn into a boutique hotel with a high-end seafood restaurant. Locally sourced ingredients, sustainable fishing practices, the kind of establishment that will attract a different class of visitor to Port Haven. It will create jobs, Griffin, and bring money into the community beyond the fishing and shipping industries." "And if her venture fails, what then?" "Then it fails," Dorothy said simply. "That's the nature of risk and opportunity. But I've done my research on Abigail Winters. She doesn't fail often." Griffin turned to leave, recognizing the immovability in Dorothy's tone. At the doorway, he paused. "When does she arrive?" "She's already here," Dorothy replied. "Checked into room 7 this morning." The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Port Haven's main street as Griffin walked along the harbor pathway. His conversation with Dorothy had left him unsettled. He wasn't accustomed to having his authority questioned, especially by someone he respected. Movement near the public docks caught his attention. A woman stood at the edge of the pier, her back to him as she gazed out at the fishing vessels returning with the day's catch. Even from a distance, Griffin could tell she wasn't a local. Her posture, the way she observed rather than participated, marked her as an outsider. She wore simple dark jeans and a cream-colored sweater that caught the golden light of the setting sun. Auburn hair cascaded over her shoulders in loose waves, moving slightly in the sea breeze. There was something in her stillness that commanded attention, a presence that seemed to make the bustling dock activity recede into the background. As if sensing his scrutiny, the woman turned. Even at a distance of 30 yards, the impact of her sea-blue eyes was immediate and unsettling. They locked with Griffin's gray ones for a moment that seemed to stretch beyond its actual duration. Her face was striking rather than conventionally beautiful. High cheekbones, a determined chin, slight crinkles at the corners of her eyes that suggested she smiled often, though she wasn't smiling now. Griffin knew instinctively this was Abigail Winters. She gave him a slight nod, neither friendly nor hostile, merely acknowledging his presence before turning back to the water. The dismissal, so casual and complete, stirred something unfamiliar in Griffin's chest. He was unaccustomed to being disregarded, especially in his own territory. Rather than approach her, he continued his walk, mind racing. There had been something in that brief eye contact recognition, perhaps, not as if she knew him personally, but as if she knew of him. Given his position in Port Haven, that wasn't surprising. What bothered him was the lack of deference, the absence of the cautious respect most newcomers showed when they realized who he was. Griffin returned to his office to find May waiting with a preliminary report on Abigail Winters. 36 years old, MBA from Wharton, spent 12 years at Coburn Financial in Boston, rising to investment director, specializing in hospitality and tourism ventures. May summarized, handing him a folder. Resigned 8 months ago to start her own development company. No criminal record, excellent credit rating, significant personal assets. She's developed 2 successful boutique hotels in coastal Massachusetts. Both are still operating with strong reviews and steady bookings. Griffin flipped through the neatly organized documents. Family. Parents deceased. Father died when she was young. Some kind of maritime accident. Details are sparse. Mother passed from cancer when Ms. Winters was in college. No siblings. Never married. No children. On local connections and any history with Port Haven or the surrounding area? May shook her head. None that I could find on short notice. She appears to have grown up primarily in the Boston area with her maternal grandparents after her father's death. Griffin continued scanning the information, looking for anything that might explain the unsettling feeling Abigail Winters' arrival had triggered. On paper, she seemed exactly what Dorothy had described, a successful independent businesswoman with the resources and experience to make Harborview Inn profitable again. So why did he feel as if a storm warning had just been issued? Keep digging, he told May. I want to know why she chose Port Haven specifically. Check property records, see if her family had any historical connections to the area, and find out more about her father's accident. After May left, Griffin pulled out the piece of wood from the trident he'd brought to the office for closer examination. The coincidence of its appearance and Abigail Winters' arrival nagged at him. He ran his fingers over the carved symbol, a simple trident that had been his father's personal emblem incorporated into the ship's official logo. Samuel Mercer had been a legend along the Maine coast, respected by fishermen and shipping magnates alike, for his knowledge of the sea and his unwavering integrity. His death had left a 13-year-old Griffin and his mother with nothing but debts and the broken pieces of a modest shipping company. Griffin's mother had never recovered from the loss, declining slowly over the next 5 years until pneumonia finally took her when Griffin was 18. Everything Griffin had built since the shipping empire, his influence in Port Haven, had been constructed on a foundation of control. Controlling his environment, controlling risk, controlling outcomes. Never again would he be at the mercy of fate or the sea or other people's decisions. Yet here was a piece of his father's ship appearing after 25 years, as if to remind him that some things remained beyond his control. And here was Abigail Winters operating outside the careful system he'd established in Port Haven. Griffin carefully returned the wood fragment to its protective case. Whatever game was being played, he intended to uncover its rules and its players before his carefully constructed world could be threatened further. The following morning, Griffin strode through Port Haven's fish market, nodding acknowledgments to the vendors and fishermen who called greetings. Despite his wealth and power, he maintained regular visible connections with the working heart of the town. It wasn't strategy. It was respect for the community that had shaped him. Mr. Mercer. Frank Calloway's weathered voice rose above the market's clamor. At 67, Frank was among the oldest active fishermen in Port Haven, his leathery skin and arthritic hands testaments to decades at sea. "Got some fine halibut just in saving the best cut for you." Griffin changed direction, heading toward Frank's modest stall. The old fisherman was one of the few people in town who remembered Griffin's father well, having worked the same waters in the same era. "Morning, Frank," Griffin said, examining the impressive fish on display. "How's the catch this week? Decent enough, though that storm pushed everything deeper for a few days." Frank began wrapping the promised halibut. "Heard you played hero again during the blow. Reynolds can't stop singing your praises down at the Anchor." Griffin shrugged off the compliment. "Right place, right time. The Coast Guard would have reached them eventually." "Eventually don't count for much when you're taking on water." Frank handed over the wrapped fish. "No charge today. Consider it a thank you from the fishing community. Could have been any of us out there." Griffin started to protest, but recognized the pride in the old man's eyes. He accepted with a nod of thanks, then asked casually, "Seen any new faces around the market this morning? I heard Harborview Inn has a new owner." Something flickered across Frank's weathered features, a momentary tension quickly masked. "Matter of fact, yes. Lady was here at dawn, asking all sorts of questions about sustainable fishing, local catch. Knew her stuff too, not just some city folk playing at coastal living." Before Griffin could inquire further, a flash of auburn hair caught his peripheral vision. Abigail Winters moved through the market with purpose, stopping occasionally to examine displays or exchange words with vendors. She carried a canvas tote already half filled with purchases, and unlike many tourists, she handled the fish and shellfish with the confidence of someone familiar with seafood selection. Frank followed Griffin's gaze, and that strange tension returned to his face. As Abigail turned in their direction, the old fisherman suddenly became intensely interested in rearranging his display. Abigail approached, her sea-blue eyes registering Griffin with recognition, but no particular concern. "Mr. Mercer, I presume?" she said, her voice carrying the slight refinement of a Boston upbringing, tempered with something warmer, more genuine. "I thought we might cross paths eventually, though I didn't expect it quite so soon." Griffin studied her, noting the directness of her gaze, the slight lift of her chin. Up close, she was smaller than he'd estimated, perhaps 5'6", which made his own towering height all the more pronounced as he stood before her. Yet she showed no hint of intimidation. "Ms. Winters," he acknowledged, "welcome to Port Haven. I understand congratulations are in order on your acquisition of Harborview Inn." "Thank you." She shifted her attention to Frank, who was still studiously avoiding looking at her. "Your halibut looks exceptional today. I'd like 2 pounds, please, for testing some recipes." Frank's hands moved mechanically to fulfill the order, his usual friendly banter conspicuously absent. Abigail turned back to Griffin. "Dorothy speaks very highly of you, Mr. Mercer. She says you're the reason Port Haven weathered the decline that affected so many other fishing communities." "Dorothy exaggerates," Griffin replied, watching her carefully. "Port Haven survives because of its people, not any one individual." A diplomatic answer. A smile touched the corners of her mouth without quite reaching her eyes. though I've heard you maintain a rather significant influence over local development decisions." The implied criticism was delivered so smoothly, Griffin almost missed it. "I have the town's best interests at heart," he said evenly. "I'm sure you believe that." Abigail accepted her wrapped halibut from Frank with a thank you that the old fisherman barely acknowledged. Most people who accumulate power usually start with good intentions. Before Griffin could respond to the veiled barb, she continued, "I'm hosting a small gathering at the inn tomorrow evening, just some local business owners and community leaders. I'd like to share my vision for Harborview and hear their thoughts. 7 o'clock, if you're interested." The invitation caught Griffin off guard. He'd expected resistance, perhaps even hostility, not inclusion. "I'll consider it," he said noncommittally. "Do that." Abigail nodded a goodbye, then paused. "Oh, and Mr. Mercer, I understand there are unofficial channels for business approval in Port Haven. I prefer to operate through official ones, just so we're clear from the start." With that, she walked away, leaving Griffin with the distinct impression he'd just been politely but firmly put in his place. It was an unfamiliar sensation, and not one he particularly enjoyed. As soon as Abigail was out of earshot, Griffin turned to Frank. "You know her." It wasn't a question, and Frank didn't treat it as one. The old fisherman sighed, shoulders slumping slightly. "Not exactly, just recognized the name is all." "Frank," Griffin's voice lowered, "if there's something I should know about Abigail Winters—" "There's nothing to tell," Frank interrupted, his voice uncharacteristically sharp. "And if there was, it'd be ancient history anyway. Let sleeping dogs lie, Griffin. Some waters are best left unfathomed." Before Griffin could press further, Frank busied himself with another customer, effectively ending the conversation. The old fisherman's reaction only deepened Griffin's unease. Frank Calloway was many things, cantankerous, stubborn, set in his ways, but evasive had never been one of them. Something about Abigail Winters had clearly disturbed the old man, and anything that disturbed Frank Calloway was something Griffin Mercer needed to understand. That evening, Griffin sat in his home office, the piece of wood from the Trident before him on the desk illuminated by his desk lamp. Outside, rain pattered against the windows, a gentle reminder of the sea's constant presence, even on calm nights. He'd called in a favor with an old contact in the Coast Guard to run a more detailed search on maritime accidents involving anyone named Winters. The preliminary results had just arrived via encrypted email, and what he'd found had sent him straight to the hidden safe where he kept his father's surviving logbooks and papers. James Winters, first officer aboard the cargo vessel Atlantic Venture, lost at sea during a storm off the Massachusetts coast in 1989. One of 14 crew members who perished when the ship went down. Survived by his wife Elizabeth and daughter Abigail, age 5. The Atlantic Venture had been a medium-sized cargo ship operating primarily between Boston and various ports along the eastern seaboard. Nothing remarkable about it, or its loss, just another tragedy in the unforgiving Atlantic. Except for one detail buried in the official report, the Atlantic Venture had diverted from its planned course due to storm conditions following the recommendation of a passing vessel identified as the Trident, captained by Samuel Mercer. Griffin's father had encountered the Atlantic Venture on what would be his penultimate voyage before his own vessel was lost. According to the report, Samuel had advised the Atlantic Venture to alter course based on his reading of the weather conditions. The cargo ship had followed his recommendation only to sail directly into the worst of the storm system. There was nothing in the report suggesting Samuel Mercer was at fault. Weather prediction in 1989 had been far less sophisticated than today's technology allowed. Yet, the connection was undeniable. Abigail Winters's father had died following advice from Griffin's father. Was this why she had come to Port Haven? Some misguided quest for answers about her father's death? Or worse, some form of delayed retribution against the Mercer name? Griffin's contemplation was interrupted by his phone. May's name flashed on the screen. "Sir, I've found something you need to see," she said without preamble. "I've been searching newspaper archives about the Trident incident and found a photograph from a memorial service held in Port Haven after the sinking. It's from the local paper, not digitized in the main databases, which is why it didn't come up in our initial searches." "What about it, Mayor?" Griffin prompted when she hesitated. "There's a child in the photograph, sir. A little girl, maybe 5 or 6 years old, standing with an older couple. The caption identifies them as family friends of crew member James Winters attending with his daughter Abigail." Griffin's hand tightened on the phone. "Are you certain it's the same Abigail Winters? The age matches. And, sir, I've compared the child's photo with recent images of Ms. Winters. It's her. There's no doubt." Griffin closed his eyes briefly, pieces falling into place with disturbing clarity. "Send me everything you've found. And May, not a word of this to anyone." After ending the call, Griffin turned back to the piece of wood from the Trident. What had seemed like coincidence now looked increasingly like calculated action. Abigail Winters hadn't randomly selected Port Haven for her business venture. She had deliberately inserted herself into the town, into Griffin's territory, for reasons connected to the deaths of both their fathers. The question was, what did she hope to accomplish? Griffin's instinct was to confront her immediately, to demand explanations. But years of business negotiations had taught him the value of information asymmetry. If Abigail didn't know he'd discovered her connection to the Trident, it gave him room to maneuver to observe her actions without her knowing she was being watched. He would attend her gathering tomorrow night. He would smile and listen and play the role of the interested local business leader. And all the while, he would be watching for any sign of her true intentions. Because one thing was now abundantly clear. Abigail Winters hadn't come to Port Haven to renovate an old inn. She'd come with a purpose connected to a tragedy 25 years in the past. A tragedy that had shaped both their lives in ways neither could have controlled. And Griffin Mercer had spent his entire adult life ensuring he would never again be at the mercy of forces beyond his control. Harborview Inn stood as a grand Victorian sentinel overlooking Port Haven's harbor, its white clapboard exterior and intricate gingerbread trim gleaming under strategically placed landscape lighting. As Griffin approached the main entrance, he noted fresh paint, repaired shutters, and new planters bursting with coastal flora, small but significant improvements made in just a few days of Abigail's ownership. Inside, the transformation was even more apparent. The formerly cluttered, dated lobby now breathed with clean, nautical-inspired elegance. Original hardwood floors had been uncovered and refinished to a warm glow. Vintage photographs of Port Haven's maritime history lined the walls, professionally matted and framed. The air carried the scent of lemon polish and fresh flowers, rather than the musty staleness Griffin remembered from his last visit years earlier. A small crowd had already gathered, perhaps 20 people representing Port Haven's business community and civic leadership. Griffin recognized everyone: the bank manager, the head of the Chamber of Commerce owners of the larger restaurants and shops, the town manager, the harbor master. The unofficial power structure of Port Haven assembled at Abigail Winters's invitation. Conversations quieted momentarily as he entered, acknowledging his presence with nods before resuming. Griffin accepted a glass of wine from a circulating server and positioned himself where he could observe the room without being obvious about it. Abigail stood near the grand staircase, engaged in conversation with Catherine Chen, who owned the town's only pharmacy. She wore a simple navy dress that managed to be both professional and flattering, her auburn hair swept up in an elegant twist that emphasized the graceful line of her neck. She laughed at something Catherine said, the sound genuine and warm. There was nothing in her demeanor to suggest someone harboring decades-old resentment or plotting some form of retribution. Yet Griffin had built his success partly on his ability to read people, and something about Abigail Winters remained tantalizingly opaque to him. As if sensing his scrutiny, Abigail glanced in his direction. A flash of recognition crossed her features, followed by a slight nod of acknowledgement. She excused herself from Catherine and made her way toward him, navigating the crowded room with graceful efficiency. "Mr. Mercer," she greeted him, extending her hand. "I'm glad you decided to come." Griffin accepted the handshake, noting the firmness of her grip despite the significant size difference between their hands. "Ms. Winters, you've been busy, I see." "Just preliminary touches," she replied, gesturing to the renovated space. "The real work begins next week when the contractors start on the guest rooms and restaurant space." "Ambitious timeline." "I prefer to think of it as efficient." Her sea-blue eyes assessed him with an intelligence that confirmed Griffin's suspicion she was far more than a simple hotelier. "Would you like a tour of the planned renovations? I have the architectural renderings in my office." Griffin recognized the invitation for what it was, an opportunity for private conversation away from the other guests. "Lead the way." Abigail guided him through the main floor to a small room that had been converted into a temporary office. Blueprints and material samples covered a large table, while a laptop sat open on an antique desk. She closed the door behind them, providing privacy without making it feel like isolation. "You've done your research on me," she said without preamble, leaning against the desk with casual confidence, "just as I've done mine on you." Griffin maintained his composure, though her directness caught him slightly off guard. "Standard business practice. I make it a point to know who's investing in Port Haven. And I make it a point to know whose territory I'm entering." She held his gaze steadily. "So let's be candid, Mr. Mercer. You're wondering why I've chosen Port Haven for my latest venture, especially since I bypassed your unofficial approval process." The thought had crossed my mind. Abigail studied him for a moment as if making a decision. "I selected Port Haven because it fits my business model perfectly: historic property, established tourist infrastructure, beautiful natural setting, but underutilized potential. Harborview Inn has every element I look for in a rehabilitation project." It was a perfectly reasonable explanation. Too reasonable given what Griffin now knew. "And the fact that my father's ship once rescued yours during a storm had nothing to do with your decision?" he asked, watching her face carefully. If he expected shock or dismay at being discovered, he was disappointed. Abigail's expression registered only mild surprise before settling back into composed neutrality. "So you found that connection," she said. "I wondered if you would. Why not mention it yourself? It seems a significant coincidence." "Because it is just a coincidence, Mr. Mercer." She straightened, moving toward the blueprints. "I was 5 years old when my father died. I have almost no memory of him or the circumstances of his death. Whatever connection existed between our fathers is ancient history with no bearing on my business decisions today." Griffin didn't believe her for a second, but he recognized skilled deflection when he encountered it. Pressing further would only entrench her position. "Then we'll consider it a historical footnote," he conceded, changing tactics. "Tell me about your plans for Harborview." If Abigail was relieved by the shift in conversation, she didn't show it. Instead, she launched into a detailed overview of her renovation plans with the precision of someone who had overseen similar projects before. The inn would feature 12 luxury guest rooms, each uniquely designed around maritime themes. The restaurant would showcase sustainable seafood with a farm-to-table approach for other ingredients. I'll be bringing in a chef from Boston initially, but training local staff with the goal of promoting from within once operations are established," she explained. The entire concept is designed to honor Port Haven's maritime heritage while elevating the visitor experience to attract a demographic with higher disposable income. "All very admirable," Griffin commented, "but Port Haven isn't the Hamptons or Nantucket. Our tourism season is short and the winters are harsh. What makes you think you can sustain a luxury operation year-round?" I don't," she replied frankly. "That's why Phase 2 includes developing special event packages for the shoulder seasons and corporate retreat options for the winter months. Port Haven's relative isolation becomes an asset for companies looking to foster team building away from distractions." Her business strategy was sound better than sound. It was innovative for the area. Despite his suspicions about her motives, Griffin found himself impressed by her thoroughness and vision. "You've considered the impact on local fishermen?" he asked. "A sustainable seafood restaurant will require consistent supply, meeting specific standards. I've already spoken with several boat captains about dedicated catches at premium prices," Abigail said. "It's a win-win. They get guaranteed sales at above-market rates, and I get first selection of the highest quality product." Griffin nodded mentally, noting which captains he would need to contact. Not to undermine her arrangements, but to verify her account. Trust but verify had been his business philosophy for 20 years. "You've clearly done your homework, Ms. Winters," he acknowledged. "But success in Port Haven isn't just about good business plans. It's about community integration. This town has generations of interconnected relationships that newcomers often find challenging to navigate." Abigail's lips curved in a knowing smile. "You mean I need your blessing to truly succeed here?" The unspoken Mercer approval that every business in town apparently requires. I mean Port Haven takes care of its own," Griffin corrected, though her assessment wasn't entirely wrong. "Those who contribute to the community's well-being find the community supports them in return. And you decide what constitutes contribution." "I have influence," Griffin admitted, "earned through years of ensuring this town's economic stability. But contrary to what you might believe, I don't rule Port Haven like some feudal lord. I simply protect what matters." Something in his phrasing caused a subtle shift in Abigail's expression, a momentary softening that vanished so quickly Griffin might have imagined it. "We may have that in common, Mr. Mercer," she said quietly. "A desire to protect what matters." Before Griffin could explore that unexpected moment of potential connection, a knock came at the office door. Catherine Chen poked her head in. "Sorry to interrupt, but the caterers are ready to serve dinner, Abigail." "Thank you, Catherine. We'll be right out." As the door closed, Abigail turned back to Griffin. "Shall we rejoin the others? I promise the food will be a preview of what Harborview's restaurant will offer." Griffin nodded, but as she moved to open the door, he said, "One last question, Ms. Winters. You mentioned you have almost no memory of your father, yet you attended his memorial service here in Port Haven after the Trident was lost." Abigail's hand froze on the doorknob. For the first time since their interactions began, genuine surprise registered on her face. "How did you know that?" "Local newspaper archives," Griffin said. "There was a photograph." She was silent for a long moment, her back still to him. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a hint of something Griffin couldn't quite identify. Sorrow, perhaps, or resignation. "My grandparents brought me. They thought it important I understand. My father had friends who mourned him, not just family." She turned to face Griffin, her composure restored, but her eyes holding a new wariness. "I remember almost nothing of that day either. Just cold rain and strange faces, and my grandmother crying." The vulnerability in her admission seemed genuine, making Griffin question his certainty about her motives. But 25 years in business had taught him that the most dangerous opponents were those who could project sincerity while concealing their true intentions. "Thank you for your candor," he said, matching her tone. "Perhaps we can continue this conversation another time." "Perhaps," she agreed, opening the door to rejoin the gathering. As they walked back to the main room, Griffin found himself reassessing Abigail Winters. Either she was telling the truth about her limited memories and coincidental business choice, or she was executing a long-planned strategy with exceptional skill. Either way, she was proving to be far more intriguing and potentially more dangerous to his carefully ordered world than he had initially anticipated. 2 days after the gathering at Harborview Inn, Griffin stood on the bridge of his largest container vessel, the Poseidon, overseeing its departure from Port Haven's commercial dock. Though he employed capable captains for all his ships, he occasionally took command himself, particularly when he needed time to think away from the constant demands of his office. The sea had always clarified his thoughts. Even as a boy, when the loss of his father had left him reeling, Griffin had found solidity in the very element that had taken Samuel Mercer away. There was honesty in the ocean's danger, a straightforward covenant: respect its power, or suffer the consequences. Unlike people, the sea never pretended to be anything other than what it was. "Course set for Portland, Mr. Mercer," reported the first officer. "Weather forecast shows clear conditions all the way. ETA 1400 hours. Griffin acknowledged the information with a nod, his mind only partially focused on the voyage. Since the revelation about Abigail's childhood connection to Port Haven, he'd had May digging deeper into records surrounding both the Atlantic venture and Trident disasters. The connections between their families seemed too significant to be coincidental, regardless of Abigail's dismissal. As the Poseidon cleared the harbor and entered open water, Griffin's satellite phone rang. May's number flashed on the screen. "Go ahead, May," he answered, stepping away from the bridge crew for privacy. "Sir, I've found something unusual in the archived records." May's voice came through clearly despite the distance. "I've been reviewing microfiche of local newspapers around the time of your father's accident, and there's a discrepancy in the reporting." Griffin's attention sharpened. "What kind of discrepancy?" The initial articles about the Trident sinking cite storm conditions as the cause, but in a follow-up piece 3 weeks later, there's a quote from a Coast Guard investigator mentioning structural anomalies inconsistent with typical storm damage found in recovered debris. "What are you saying, May?" "I'm not sure, sir. The investigation's final report still concluded it was weather-related, but that particular investigator's name doesn't appear on the final documentation. It could be nothing. Or it could be something," Griffin finished. "What else have you found about Abigail Winters?" "Her business credentials check out completely. The boutique hotels she developed in Massachusetts are highly successful, well-reviewed, and financially sound. She has no debt, substantial liquid assets, and an excellent professional reputation. Personal life: very private. No serious relationships that I could discover. Belongs to several professional organizations and sits on 2 non-profit boards in Boston, both related to marine conservation. One interesting note: she makes an annual donation to a small foundation that provides scholarships for children who've lost parents in maritime accidents." Griffin absorbed this information, trying to reconcile it with his suspicions. Everything about Abigail's background painted a picture of success and stability, not someone nursing a decades-old grievance. "Sir," May continued, hesitation evident in her voice. "There's one more thing. I found an old employee manifest for the Trident. One name stood out: Franklin Calloway, listed as a deckhand." "Frank?" Griffin's surprise was genuine. "That's impossible. Frank was at my father's memorial service. He helped my mother with arrangements." "The manifest is clear, sir. and I checked Port Haven's employment records from that period. Frank Calloway was officially hired by the harbor master's office 2 weeks after the Trident was lost. Griffin's mind raced. Frank had always been a fixture in Port Haven, one of his father's contemporaries, who had transitioned from deep-sea fishing to local operations as he aged. Griffin had never questioned Frank's history or his presence at the memorial, because it had seemed natural, one seaman honoring another. But if Frank had actually been on the Trident when it went down, that would make him the only survivor, Griffin said more to himself than to May. Yes, sir, and possibly the only person who knows exactly what happened that day. Griffin ended the call with instructions for May to continue her research but maintain absolute discretion. As he returned to the bridge, his mind churned with implications. If Frank had survived the sinking of the Trident, why had he never mentioned it? Why pretend to be just another local fisherman mourning Samuel Mercer's loss? And why had he reacted so strangely to Abigail Winters at the fish market? The connections were becoming too numerous to dismiss as coincidence. Abigail's father dies following advice from Samuel Mercer. Years later, Samuel's own vessel is lost with all hands, except apparently Frank Calloway, who inexplicably keeps his survival secret. Now Abigail Winters appears in Port Haven buying property and establishing herself in Griffin's territory. Something larger was at play, some pattern Griffin couldn't yet discern. But one thing was increasingly clear. The past his father had left behind contained secrets that might now be threatening the future Griffin had built. The Poseidon returned to Port Haven late that evening, gliding into its berth with the precision that characterized all of Griffin's operations. After completing the necessary post-voyage protocols, he drove directly to Frank Calloway's modest home near the southern edge of town. Lights still burned in the front windows despite the late hour. Frank had always been a night owl, claiming the habits of a lifetime at sea were impossible to break, even years after reducing his fishing to day trips only. The old fisherman answered Griffin's knock with visible surprise, which quickly shifted to wariness when he recognized his visitor. "Griffin, what brings you here this time of night?" "We need to talk, Frank," Griffin said simply. "About the Trident." Frank's weathered face seemed to age another decade in an instant. Without a word, he stepped back, allowing Griffin to enter the small, cluttered living room that smelled of pipe tobacco and the sea. "Been waiting 25 years for this conversation," Frank said quietly, lowering himself into a worn armchair. "Figured it might come someday. Just didn't expect it now." Griffin remained standing, his imposing height making him seem even larger in the confines of the small room. "You were on board when she went down." It wasn't a question, but Frank nodded anyway. "Aye, last voyage I ever took beyond the harbor limits." "Why didn't you ever say anything? Why let everyone believe all hands were lost?" Frank reached for his pipe on a side table, his gnarled fingers working through the familiar ritual of packing and lighting it. Only when the sweet smoke curled around his head did he meet Griffin's gaze again. "Some truths don't help nobody, boy. Just cause more pain without changing what's done." "I deserve to know what happened to my father," Griffin said, an unexpected edge of raw emotion in his voice. Frank drew deeply on his pipe. "What happened is he drowned when his ship went down in a storm. That's the truth of it, same as the official report says." "But not the whole truth," Griffin pressed. May found a newspaper quote mentioning structural anomalies in the wreckage. "The Trident was well maintained. My father was meticulous about safety." Frank's eyes closed briefly, as if in pain. "Your father was a good man, Griffin. Best captain I ever sailed under. What happened to the Trident wasn't his fault." "Then whose fault was it?" The old fisherman shook his head. "I've said too much already. There's things you're better off not knowing, especially now. Why especially now? Frank's gaze sharpened. Because of her. Because she's here asking questions, stirring up waters that have been still for 25 years. Abigail Winters, Griffin said, watching Frank's reaction carefully. You know who she is, then? I know her father died when the Atlantic venture went down after receiving coarse advice from my father. Frank barked a harsh laugh, devoid of humor. That's what the reports say, right enough. Records are useful things. They tell the story someone once told. Griffin's patience was wearing thin. Stop speaking in riddles, Frank. If you know something about Abigail Winters, or why she's really in Port Haven, tell me plainly. The old fisherman studied Griffin for a long moment, smoke wreathing his head like a spectral halo. You've built something fine here, Griffin. Your daddy would be proud of what you've made of Mercer Shipping, how you've looked after this town. Some things are best left buried for everyone's sake. That's not your decision to make, Griffin said, frustration evident in his tone. No, Frank agreed suddenly, sounding very tired. I suppose it ain't. But it ain't yours either, son. Some truths belong to more than just one man. He tapped his pipe against an ashtray, then looked up at Griffin with eyes that had seen too much and kept too many secrets. All I'll say is, this be careful around that woman. She ain't just here for that old inn, no matter what she claims. And when the truth finally surfaces, and it will, now that she's here, nobody's legacy is gonna come through unscathed. Not her daddy's, not yours, and not mine. Griffin recognized the finality in Frank's tone. The old man would say no more tonight, perhaps no more ever. But he had confirmed Griffin's suspicions. Abigail Winters was in Port Haven for reasons connected to their shared past, reasons that threatened the careful order Griffin had established. Thank you for your honesty, such as it was, Griffin said, moving toward the door. But I want you to know, Frank, I will discover what really happened to my father, with or without your help. Frank nodded solemnly. I expect you will. Just be prepared for what you might find. Truth ain't always the comfort we hope for. As Griffin drove home through Port Haven's quiet streets, Frank's warning echoed in his mind. The old fisherman's cryptic statements suggested layers of deception surrounding both shipwrecks, deceptions that had shaped Griffin's life without his knowledge. Approaching his clifftop home, Griffin caught sight of Harborview Inn across the harbor, a few lights still glowing in its windows despite the late hour. In one of those rooms, Abigail Winters was pursuing her own agenda, one that somehow intersected with the tragedy that had defined Griffin's youth. Two paths lay before him: confront Abigail directly with what he knew and what he suspected, or continue his investigation, quietly gathering information until he had a clearer picture of the truth she sought. The businessman in him favored the latter approach. Information was power, and revealing his knowledge prematurely would surrender an advantage. But something deeper, more primal, pushed him toward confrontation. 25 years was too long to wait for answers about his father's death. As Griffin entered his empty home, the decision crystallized in his mind. He would give Frank one more chance to share what he knew voluntarily. Then he would take a more direct approach with Abigail Winters. One way or another, the secrets buried with the trident would finally surface. And Griffin Mercer would be ready when they did, whatever the cost to the legacy he'd built, or the carefully ordered world he controlled. The sea kept nothing hidden forever. Eventually, even the deepest wrecks revealed their secrets. The annual Port Haven Seafood Festival transformed the waterfront each May, drawing visitors from throughout New England to celebrate the bounty of the Atlantic. Tents and booths lined the main pier, Local restaurants offered their finest seafood creations, and fishing vessels decked in colorful flags provided tours of the harbor. For 3 days, the normally working waterfront became a vibrant marketplace and communal gathering space. Griffin had always viewed the festival with mixed feelings. While he appreciated the economic boost it provided local businesses, the crowds and disruption to shipping operations created logistical headaches. This year, however, he found himself walking the festival grounds with greater purpose, scanning the throngs for a particular shade of auburn hair. 2 weeks had passed since his late-night conversation with Frank, and the old fisherman had been conspicuously scarce since then, taking his small boat farther out than usual and returning at odd hours. Griffin's investigation had continued through May's diligent research, but had yielded little beyond what they already knew. Both the Atlantic Venture and the Trident had gone down in storms. Both disasters had shaped Abigail and Griffin's lives, and Frank Calloway somehow connected these events while refusing to explain how. Mr. Mercer. Griffin turned to find Dorothy Sullivan approaching, leaning on a carved walking stick, but moving with surprising vigor for her age. She gestured toward a nearby food stand. "Have you tried Abigail's preview booth yet? She's offering samples of what will be on the Harborview menu. Quite remarkable." Griffin glanced in the direction Dorothy indicated. A small but elegant booth stood at the far end of the pier, a hand-painted sign announcing Harborview Inn, a taste of what's to come. A line of festival-goers waited patiently for samples, and there, serving alongside a young chef in white, was Abigail Winters. She wore simple jeans and a blue linen shirt rolled to the elbows, her auburn hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She laughed as she handed a sample to a young child bending slightly to explain something about the dish. "I haven't had the opportunity yet," Griffin replied. "Then you must come with me," Dorothy insisted, taking his arm with the prerogative of age. "I've known you since you were a gangly teenager, Griffin Mercer. The least you can do is escort an old woman to get some lunch." Griffin knew better than to argue with Dorothy when she used that tone. As they approached the booth, he observed Abigail in her element, confident, gracious, engaged with each person she served. There was nothing in her manner to suggest hidden agendas or secret investigations. She appeared genuinely invested in her role as Port Haven's newest business owner. When she looked up and saw Griffin with Dorothy, a brief flash of surprise crossed her features before she composed herself with a warm smile. "Dorothy, I was hoping you'd stop by." She turned to Griffin with a more measured greeting. "Mr. Mercer, enjoying the festival? Griffin was just telling me how eager he was to sample your chef's creations," Dorothy said before he could respond, her innocent tone belied by the mischievous glint in her eyes. Abigail's lips quirked in amusement. "Was he indeed? Then we mustn't disappoint." She conferred briefly with the chef, who prepared 2 small plates with evident care. Maine lobster with brown butter emulsion and coastal herbs, plus a side of scallop crudo with sea buckthorn and preserved lemon, Chef Laurent's signature dishes. Griffin accepted the offered plate, acutely aware of the watchful eyes of festival-goers curious about this interaction between Port Haven's most powerful resident and its newest entrepreneur. Maintaining public appearances, he sampled the lobster, finding it perfectly prepared, sweet, tender, enhanced, rather than overwhelmed by the accompanying flavors. "Exceptional," he acknowledged genuinely. "Chef Laurent has impressive skills." High praise from Port Haven's most discerning palate, Abigail responded, her tone making it unclear whether she was being sincere or gently mocking. "Abigail has requested use of the harbor front for a special event next month," Dorothy interjected, clearly enjoying her role as instigator. "The official reopening of Harborview's restaurant. I told her she should speak with you directly about permits." Griffin raised an eyebrow. "The harbor master handles event permits." "Yes, But we both know Stanley consults you before approving anything that might affect shipping schedules, Dorothy replied bluntly. Abigail observed this exchange with shrewd interest. I was planning to follow proper channels, but since the opportunity has presented itself, she wiped her hands on a towel and stepped from behind the booth. Could I have 5 minutes of your time, Mr. Mercer? I promise not to keep you long from your festival duties. The strategic retreat from public view suited Griffin's purposes. He nodded agreement and followed as Abigail led the way to a quieter section of the pier, away from the bustling festival crowds. Dorothy remained behind, sampling more of Chef Laurent's offerings with evident satisfaction at having engineered this meeting. You've been investigating me, Abigail said without preamble. Once they were alone, her back to the harbor sea breeze lifting strands of auburn hair around her face. The direct approach caught Griffin off guard, though he maintained his composed exterior. I make it a point to know who's operating in Port Haven, he replied evenly. That's not what I mean. Her blue eyes held his with unflinching directness. You've been asking specific questions about my father and his connection to the Trident. You've been looking into the accident reports, and you've been trying to get Frank Calloway to talk. Griffin studied her, reassessing yet again. You seem remarkably well informed about my activities. Port Haven isn't that large a community, Mr. Mercer. People talk. She crossed her arms, her stance both defensive and challenging. What I want to know is why. Why dig into 25-year-old tragedies? What are you hoping to find? The question presented a crossroads. Griffin could continue the careful dance of partial truths and polite evasions they'd engaged in since her arrival, or he could lay his cards on the table and see how she responded. The businessman in him counseled caution, but something about Abigail Winters demanded honesty. I found a piece of the Trident the night we rescued the Northern Star's crew, he said, watching her reaction closely. A section of wood with my father's emblem in waters, where no debris from the Trident should be looking far too preserved for something that's been underwater for 25 years. Surprise flickered in Abigail's eyes, genuine surprise, not the calculated kind. You found a piece of the Trident recently. Her voice had lost its confrontational edge, replaced by what sounded like authentic curiosity. Do you still have it? Griffin nodded. In my safe. I've told no one except you. Why tell me? Because our father's deaths are connected somehow. Because Frank Calloway gets nervous whenever your name is mentioned. And because you're in Port Haven for reasons beyond renovating an old inn. Griffin took a step closer, his voice lowering. So perhaps it's time for some candor between us, Ms. Winters. Why are you really here? Abigail held his gaze for a long moment, something unreadable shifting in her expression. Finally, she glanced around to ensure they weren't being overheard. My father's death certificate says he drowned when the Atlantic Venture went down in a storm, she said quietly. But 8 months ago, I found something in my grandmother's attic after she passed away. A journal my father kept documenting concerns about unusual cargo being transported on his ship. Cargo that wasn't on the manifest. Griffin frowned. What kind of cargo? He didn't specify, but he mentioned meeting with a captain he trusted to discuss his concerns. She paused meaningfully. A captain named Samuel Mercer. The implication hung in the air between them. Griffin processed this new information, trying to fit it into the puzzle he'd been assembling. You believe their deaths weren't accidents? It wasn't a question, but Abigail nodded anyway. I believe there's more to the story than what's in the official reports. I came to Port Haven to find answers, yes, but not to cause trouble for you or your company. Whatever happened, it was 25 years ago. I just want the truth about how my father died. Her sincerity seemed genuine, but Griffin had learned long ago that appearances could be deceiving. And Harborview Inn, was that just a convenient cover story? No. A flash of irritation crossed her features. I'm a businesswoman, Mr. Mercer. I don't invest millions in properties as cover stories. Harborview is a legitimate venture that happens to give me a reason to be in Port Haven while I conduct my personal research. Griffin considered his next words carefully. What do you know about Frank Calloway? Something cautious entered Abigail's expression. Only that he was supposedly on the Trident when it sank, yet somehow survived without any official record of his survival. He refuses to discuss what really happened that day. Says some truths are better left buried. Abigail's eyes narrowed. Do you believe that? No, Griffin said firmly. I believe I have a right to know what happened to my father, just as you have a right to know what happened to yours. A moment of silent understanding passed between them, an acknowledgement of shared purpose, despite the wariness that still existed. Perhaps, Abigail suggested, we'd make more progress working together than working separately, or at cross purposes. The proposal made strategic sense, yet Griffin hesitated. Cooperation would mean surrendering his information advantage and trusting someone whose ultimate motivations remained unclear. But it would also potentially accelerate his search for answers about his father's death. Before he could respond, shouts erupted from the main festival area. Griffin turned to see people pointing toward the harbor entrance. A sleek modern yacht was gliding into Port Haven, a vessel that dwarfed the local fishing boats and pleasure craft with its gleaming white hull and tinted glass windows. "Who's that?" Abigail asked, shading her eyes against the midday sun. Griffin felt an unexpected tension in his shoulders. "That," he said with carefully controlled neutrality, "is Malcolm Reynolds, CEO of Neptune Shipping." Neptune Shipping, I don't think I'm familiar with them. They're relatively new to the Northeast market, based primarily out of Miami until recently. They've been expanding aggressively up the coast, acquiring smaller shipping operations and marina facilities. Griffin watched the yacht maneuver toward the guest moorings. Reynolds has approached me about selling Mercer Shipping 3 times in the past 2 years. And you declined. Mercer Shipping isn't for sale, Griffin stated flatly, not to Reynolds or anyone else. Abigail studied the yacht with newfound interest. Interesting timing for him to appear in Port Haven during the busiest festival weekend of the year. Reynolds has a talent for dramatic entrances, Griffin said dryly. He'll claim he's just here to enjoy the festival, but he'll use the opportunity to assess potential acquisitions and make connections with local business owners. As if on cue, a small tender detached from the yacht, carrying several figures toward the main dock. Griffin recognized Reynolds' distinctive silver hair even at a distance. I should go, Griffin said, his attention now divided. Reynolds will want to make a public show of greeting me as an old friend and respected competitor. And you need to maintain appearances, Abigail observed shrewdly. Go! We can continue our conversation another time. She hesitated, then added, About your proposal for cooperation, I'm amenable with conditions. Perhaps dinner tomorrow night, neutral territory. Captain's table, 7 p.m. Griffin nodded agreement, his mind already shifting to the impending interaction with Reynolds. Tomorrow at 7. As he walked away, Griffin felt a curious mixture of anticipation and unease. The conversation with Abigail had revealed more questions than answers, but had also established a tentative alliance that might prove valuable. Reynolds's unexpected appearance added a complicating variable to an already complex situation. Something told Griffin that the secrets surrounding the Trident and Atlantic venture were about to become even more tangled and potentially more dangerous than he had initially believed. Malcolm Reynolds cut an impressive figure, as he strode along the festival grounds greeting locals with the practiced charm of a politician on campaign. At 58, he maintained the physique of a man 15 years younger, his tailored casual wear emphasizing broad shoulders and a trim waist. His silver hair was expertly styled, his Mediterranean tan suggesting a life of luxury rather than honest labor on the decks of working vessels. Flanking him were two younger men in similar casual but expensive attire, assistants or executives Griffin surmised brought along to assess Port Haven's potential, while their boss handled the public relations aspects of the visit. Griffin intercepted the group near the central pavilion where the festival committee had set up a small stage for announcements and presentations. "Malcolm," he greeted, extending his hand with professional courtesy that didn't reach his eyes. "Unexpected to see Neptune shipping represented at our modest festival." Reynolds's smile revealed perfect white teeth as he clasped Griffin's hand firmly. "Griffin, always a pleasure. I was cruising the coast, heard about your seafood festival, and thought, why not? Support local maritime communities, enjoy some fresh lobster. Perhaps reconnect with the legendary Griffin Mercer." The performance was flawless, jovial, slightly flattering, crafted for the benefit of the townsfolk who had stopped to observe this meeting of maritime powers. Griffin matched Reynolds's public persona with his own. "Port Haven welcomes all visitors during the festival. I hope you'll enjoy what our community has to offer." "Already am," Reynolds replied, gesturing expansively at the bustling waterfront. "Charming town, Griffin. Absolutely charming. Reminds me of what coastal communities used to be before mass tourism and corporate development steamrolled their authentic character." The irony of this statement coming from a man whose business model involved acquiring and transforming such communities wasn't lost on Griffin, but he maintained his diplomatic facade. "Port Haven values its heritage," he said simply. "How long will you be staying?" "Just the weekend, though I've asked my team to explore the area more thoroughly. Always looking for new opportunities, you know." Reynolds glanced toward the harbor, his gaze settling on the Harborview Inn's distinctive profile. "Speaking of which, I understand your historic inn has new ownership. Bit of a change for Port Haven, isn't it? Outside investment coming in." The casual inquiry carried undercurrents Griffin recognized immediately. Reynolds had done his homework before arriving, not surprising, but noteworthy. "Harborview Inn has indeed changed hands. Ms. Winters has ambitious renovation plans that should benefit our tourism sector." "Winters?" Reynolds' expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "Abigail Winters from Boston." Griffin watched him carefully. "You know her." Reynolds waved dismissively. "Financial circles in New England are rather small. I believe we've crossed paths at charity functions. Talented investor, as I recall." He turned to one of his companions. "David, make a note. We should pay our respects to Ms. Winters before departing. Perhaps Neptune Shipping could sponsor one of her opening events." The younger man nodded, making a show of typing on his phone, though Griffin suspected the interaction was more performance than practical. "Now," Reynolds continued, clapping his hands together, "I heard there's a lobster roll competition happening at 2. Would you care to join us as we sample the local cuisine, Griffin? I'd value your insider knowledge on which establishments truly represent Port Haven's best." The invitation was a transparent attempt to extend their interaction to be seen publicly with Port Haven's most influential figure. Griffin had no interest in spending more time with Reynolds than necessary, but diplomacy required a certain level of accommodation. "I have commitments to attend to," he declined smoothly. "But the festival committee chair, Elaine Barnes, would be delighted to guide you. Let me introduce you." After making the introduction and extracting himself from Reynolds's presence, Griffin sought a vantage point from which he could observe without being obvious. Something about Reynolds's reaction to Abigail's name had triggered his instincts. The recognition had seemed genuine, but the casualness that followed felt rehearsed. Griffin found May near the Mercer Shipping informational booth, where she was overseeing a display about the company's environmental initiatives. "I need you to add something to your research," he said quietly after drawing her aside. "Look for any connections between Malcolm Reynolds or Neptune Shipping and Abigail Winters. Also expand the timeline on the Trident investigation. Check if Neptune Shipping existed 25 years ago, or if Reynolds was involved with any other shipping company during that period." May nodded, her expression serious. "Reynolds's arrival seems conveniently timed." "Too convenient," Griffin agreed. "He's here for a reason beyond festival lobster rolls." "Do you think he's connected to the shipwreck somehow?" Griffin considered the possibility. "I don't know, but Reynolds has always wanted Mercer Shipping, and he's not a man who accepts rejection easily. If he's learned I'm investigating my father's death, he might see it as leverage or distraction." "I'll start immediately," May promised. "Should I continue alone, or would you like me to coordinate with Ms. Winters' research as well?" The question caught Griffin off guard. "What makes you think Winters and I are coordinating research?" A hint of amusement crossed May's usually professional demeanor. "With respect, sir, I observed your conversation with her at the pier. It had the hallmarks of a negotiation reaching tentative agreement. And given your shared interest in the shipwreck's cooperation, seems logical." Griffin sometimes forgot how perceptive his assistant could be. "We're discussing the possibility," he acknowledged. "For now, continue independently. I'll let you know if that changes." As May departed, Griffin turned his attention back to the festival grounds. Reynolds and his entourage were now at the judging tent for the lobster roll competition, the CEO making a show of enthusiastic participation. Abigail had returned to her booth, serving samples and engaging with visitors. And somewhere in Port Haven, Frank Calloway held secrets that connected these disparate elements, secrets he'd kept for 25 years, but might not be able to maintain much longer now that the key players were converging on this small coastal town. The festival continued around Griffin, but he barely registered the music, the laughter, the celebration of Port Haven's maritime heritage. His mind was already mapping connections, evaluating risks, and planning his next moves in an investigation that grew more complex by the hour. The captain's table occupied a converted warehouse at the southern end of Port Haven's working waterfront. Unlike the upscale establishments catering to summer visitors in the town center, the restaurant served primarily locals, fishermen ending their shifts, dock workers taking lunch breaks year-round, residents seeking honest food without tourist pricing. Griffin arrived precisely at 7, conscious of the glances and nods of recognition from the regular patrons. His presence at the captain's table wasn't unusual. He made a point of patronizing local businesses, but his dining alone was typically a sign he sought privacy with his thoughts. Tonight, however, he requested a table for 2 in the corner booth that offered the most seclusion. Abigail arrived 5 minutes later, dressed simply in dark jeans and a forest green sweater that complemented her auburn hair. She navigated the predominantly male establishment with confident ease, ignoring the curious stares her presence generated. Port Haven might be accustomed to summer visitors, but a sophisticated businesswoman dining with Griffin Mercer at the decidedly unglamorous captain's table was noteworthy indeed. "This place has character," she observed as she slid into the booth across from Griffin. "Exactly what I would have chosen for neutral territory." "Best seafood chowder on the eastern seaboard," Griffin replied. "No fancy presentation, just honest food made by people who understand the sea." A server approached, greeting Griffin by name, before taking their orders chowder and grilled haddock for both, though Abigail requested a glass of white wine while Griffin stayed with water. When they were alone again, Abigail placed a slim leather portfolio on the table between them. As discussed, a gesture of good faith. Copies of the relevant pages from my father's journal, along with the research I've compiled about the Atlantic Venture sinking. Griffin accepted the portfolio, opening it to find meticulously organized documents protected in clear sleeves. The journal pages were photographed rather than original, showing a neat, masculine handwriting recording daily shipboard activities, weather conditions, and cargo notations. The concerning entries begin 3 weeks before the final voyage, Abigail explained. My father notes discrepancies in the cargo manifest weight, inconsistencies, containers loaded without proper documentation, unusual security measures for what was supposedly routine freight. Griffin scanned the indicated passages, recognizing the professional observations of an experienced first officer. James Winters had been methodical in his documentation, noting dates, times, and specific container numbers. He brought his concerns to the captain, Griffin observed, reading further. Who dismissed them, Abigail confirmed. That's when he sought outside counsel from a captain he respected, your father. Griffin found the entry describing the meeting with Samuel Mercer. It was brief but revealing. Met with Captain S. Mercer of the Trident during Portland layover. Shared concerns about container anomalies. He agrees something isn't right. Suggested documenting everything and contacting shipping authority when we return. Says he encountered similar situation 2 years ago with Harrison Freight. We'll help when we dock next week. Harrison Freight. Griffin repeated the name, triggering a distant memory. Chester Harrison was my father's business partner before I was born. They had a falling out when I was very young. Harrison went on to found his own shipping company, became quite successful before his death. When did he die? Abigail asked, her expression intent. Early 90s, I believe. Car accident, if I remember correctly. Griffin frowned, making connections. It would have been shortly after the Trident was lost. Their conversation paused as the server delivered their chowder and wine. When they were alone again, Abigail leaned forward, her voice lowered. My research shows Harrison Shipping was acquired by a holding company called Oceanic Ventures immediately following Chester Harrison's death. Oceanic Ventures later reorganized and emerged as Neptune Shipping. Griffin felt the pieces shifting, forming a pattern he hadn't anticipated. Reynolds. Abigail nodded. Malcolm Reynolds was a junior executive at Harrison Shipping who rose quickly after Chester's death. He eventually led the reorganization that created Neptune. The implications were significant. Reynolds had direct connections to both Harrison and the shipping company that had employed James Winters. And now he appeared in Port Haven just as Griffin and Abigail were investigating the connected shipwrecks. This can't be coincidence, Griffin said, his appetite forgotten, despite the excellent chowder before him. I don't believe in coincidences of this magnitude, Abigail agreed. But we need more than circumstantial connections. We need to understand what actually happened to the Trident and the Atlantic Venture. Which brings us back to Frank Calloway. Abigail's expression grew thoughtful. He's avoided me since I arrived in Port Haven. When I approached him at the market that first day, he practically fled. He knows who I am, Griffin. He knows why I'm here. He's the missing piece, Griffin agreed. The only known survivor of the Trident, yet there's no official record of his survival. No rescue report, no medical treatment documentation, nothing to explain how he alone lived when 17 others died. Including your father. Griffin nodded, a familiar ache resurfacing at the mention of Samuel Mercer's death. Though 25 years had passed, some wounds never fully healed. Frank told me some truths are best left buried, he said. But I don't accept that. Not when those truths might explain what happened to our fathers. Abigail studied him with unexpected sympathy. You were 13 when the trident went down. Yes, old enough to understand death, too young to handle the business my father left behind. My mother tried, but she had no experience with shipping operations. By the time she died, 5 years later, we'd lost almost everything except a single vessel and the family home. I'm sorry, Abigail said quietly. I was even younger when I lost my father, just 5. I have almost no memories of him, just feelings. Warmth, safety, the smell of sea salt when he returned from voyages. The personal sharing created an unexpected intimacy between them. For a brief moment, they weren't business rivals or reluctant allies, but simply two people who had experienced similar losses. How do we approach Frank? Abigail asked, returning to the practical matter at hand. He's clearly determined to keep his secrets. Griffin considered the question. Direct confrontation hasn't worked, but there might be another way. The annual Lighthouse Remembrance Ceremony is tomorrow night. Lighthouse Remembrance, a Port Haven tradition. Every year on May 16th, the community gathers at the lighthouse to remember those lost at sea. Lanterns are launched into the harbor, one for each person being honored. Frank never misses it. He always launches one for my father, though he's never explained why he feels that particular obligation. Understanding dawned in Abigail's eyes. An emotional moment surrounded by a community focused on honoring the dead might make him more receptive to discussing the truth, Griffin finished. Especially if approached by both of us together. A united front, Abigail mused. It could work, or it could make him retreat further. It's a risk, Griffin acknowledged. But we're running out of alternatives. Their dinners arrived temporarily, shifting the conversation to lighter topics. Griffin found himself unexpectedly comfortable in Abigail's company. Behind her businesslike exterior lay a sharp intelligence and dry wit that emerged as the evening progressed. She spoke knowledgeably about the shipping industry, asked thoughtful questions about Port Haven's history, and shared amusing anecdotes from her hotel restoration projects. By the time they finished dessert, a simple but perfect blueberry cobbler Griffin realized hours had passed in what had felt like minutes. The restaurant had emptied around them, the staff beginning closing procedures while discreetly allowing Port Haven's most prominent citizen to finish his meal without pressure. "We should go," Griffin said, signaling for the check. "I've kept Simon and his staff late enough." Outside, the May evening carried the crisp clarity unique to coastal Maine in late spring. Stars blazed overhead in a cloudless sky, their light competing with the soft glow of Port Haven street lamps. The working harbor had settled into nighttime quiet fishing vessels secured at their moorings, crews long since departed for home or local bars. "I parked behind the inn," Abigail said as they exited the restaurant. "It's a pleasant walk from here." Griffin fell into step beside her, his tall frame automatically adjusting his stride to match her shorter one. They walked in companionable silence, the gentle sound of lapping water and distant buoy bells providing a soothing backdrop. "You've done impressive work with Harborview already," Griffin observed as the inn's illuminated facade came into view across the harbor. "The exterior renovations have transformed it." "Just the beginning," Abigail replied, evident pride in her voice. "The interior work is more substantial. We're preserving the historical elements while updating the infrastructure and amenities. The restaurant kitchen has been completely rebuilt to Chef Laurent's specifications. When do you plan to open?" "Soft opening in 3 weeks for the restaurant, full hotel opening by mid-June, just in time for the summer season." She glanced up at him. "You should come to the preview dinner, see what your town's newest establishment has to offer." The invitation seemed genuine, rather than merely polite, catching Griffin slightly off guard. Their tentative alliance had been formed out of necessity and mutual interest in the shipwreck investigation, not social inclination. "I'd like that," he found himself saying. They had reached the harbor viewing platform, a small wooden deck, extending over the water that offered an unobstructed view of Port Haven's nighttime panorama. Abigail paused, resting her hands on the railing, as she gazed across the dark water toward the lighthouse, its beam sweeping regularly across the harbor entrance. "It's beautiful here," she said softly. "I understand why you've worked so hard to protect it." Griffin stood beside her, aware of her presence in a way that transcended their business relationship or investigative partnership. The moonlight caught in her auburn hair, silvering the strands that escaped her casual styling. Her profile was etched against the darkness, determined chin-straight nose, the slight furrow between her brows that appeared when she was deep in thought. "It's not just the place," he found himself saying. "It's the people, the community. Port Haven took care of me after my mother died, gave me chances I wouldn't have had elsewhere. Everything I've built has been about ensuring this town continues to thrive, that its people have security and opportunity." Abigail turned to face him, her expression thoughtful. "That's why you maintain such tight control over development and business operations. It's not about power for its own sake. It's about protection." The insight surprised him, not because it was incorrect, but because so few people had ever understood his motivations so clearly. "Yes," he acknowledged simply. "I misjudged you initially," Abigail admitted. "I assumed you were another wealthy businessman protecting his territory from competition. I didn't consider you might have deeper reasons for your methods." The unexpected honesty created an opening for reciprocal candor. "And I misjudged you," Griffin responded. "I assumed your interest in Port Haven was either purely financial or motivated by some desire for retribution related to your father's death." And now, Griffin considered the question, aware they had ventured beyond strategic alliance into more personal territory. "Now I believe you genuinely want answers about your father, just as I want answers about mine. And I think your business ventures are separate from that quest, not merely a cover for it." Abigail's lips curved in a slight smile. "Progress, Mr. Mercer?" "Griffin," he corrected, surprised by his own informality. "Griffin," she repeated the name, sounding different in her voice. "Then you should call me Abigail." A moment of silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken awareness of some subtle shift in their dynamic. The professional distance they had maintained was eroding, revealing a connection neither had anticipated. Abigail broke the moment, first glancing at her watch. "I should get back to the inn. Chef Laurent and I have an early meeting with local suppliers tomorrow." "I'll walk you," Griffin offered. "That's not necessary. It's a short distance, and Port Haven seems quite safe." "It is safe," Griffin assured her. "But it's also courteous to see one's dinner companion safely home." Abigail looked as if she might argue further, then acquiesced with a nod. They continued along the harbor path toward Harborview Inn, their conversation turning to lighter topics: the success of the seafood festival, the upcoming summer tourism season, the challenges of operating a seasonal business in a town with harsh winters. As they approached the inn's illuminated entrance, Abigail paused. "Thank you for dinner, and for being willing to share your research. I think we'll make more progress working together than separately." "I agree," Griffin said. "I'll meet you at the lighthouse tomorrow evening before the ceremony begins. 7 o'clock. 7 it is." She extended her hand in a businesslike gesture that seemed at odds with the evening's more personal tone. "Good night, Griffin." He accepted her hand, noting the strength in her grip, despite the significant size difference between them. "Good night, Abigail." As he walked back toward his home on the opposite side of the harbor, Griffin found himself reflecting on the unexpected developments of the day. What had begun as a cautious information exchange had evolved into something more complex, a partnership based on shared purpose rather than mere convenience. And beneath that partnership, something else was developing, a personal connection he hadn't sought or anticipated but couldn't quite dismiss. Abigail Winters was unlike anyone he'd encountered in Port Haven or his broader business circles. Her combination of intelligence, determination, and surprising emotional insight presented a challenge to the careful distance he typically maintained in his relationships. Griffin pushed these thoughts aside as he approached his home, focusing instead on the practical matters at hand. Tomorrow's Lighthouse Remembrance Ceremony offered their best opportunity to break through Frank Calloway's reticence. Whatever personal complications might be developing between himself and Abigail, the priority remained uncovering the truth about their father's deaths. Yet as he entered his empty house, the memory of Abigail in the moonlight lingered, suggesting that the investigation's outcome might not be the only significant change on Port Haven's horizon. The Port Haven Lighthouse stood on a rocky promontory at the harbor's northern edge, its white tower rising 80 feet above the surrounding landscape. Built in 1873, it had guided vessels safely into port through countless storms and foggy nights. Now automated, the lighthouse keeper's cottage had been converted into a small museum documenting Port Haven's maritime history. By tradition, the annual remembrance ceremony began at sunset, when the lighthouse's beam first became visible against the darkening sky. Families gathered on the surrounding grounds, each holding paper lanterns inscribed with the names of loved ones lost to the sea. As darkness fell, the lanterns would be lit and launched into the harbor, creating a floating constellation of remembrance that drifted out toward the open ocean. Griffin arrived early, parking his truck in the small lot beside the keeper's cottage. The evening was mild, with just enough breeze to carry lanterns seaward without dispersing them too quickly. Perfect conditions for the ceremony that had been part of Port Haven's traditions since long before Griffin was born. He found Abigail waiting near the lighthouse base, gazing out at the harbor where boats were already gathering for the ceremony. She wore a simple blue dress with a light cardigan, her auburn hair loose around her shoulders. In her hands, she held two paper lanterns, one white, one blue. "I hope you don't mind," she said as he approached. "I took the liberty of preparing lanterns for both our fathers." The thoughtful gesture touched Griffin unexpectedly. "Thank you. That was kind." She handed him the white lantern, which bore Samuel Mercer's name in careful calligraphy. "The ceremony is beautiful. Dorothy explained the tradition to me yesterday." Griffin nodded, looking out at the gathering community members. "It started in the 1800s, when fishing losses were more common. Evolved over the years, but the essence remains the same, remembering those the sea has taken, honoring their sacrifice." His gaze swept the growing crowd, searching for Frank Calloway's distinctive figure. Frank usually arrives just before sunset. He's private about his participation, tends to stand apart from the main groups. "Like now," Abigail said quietly, nodding toward the rocky shoreline below the lighthouse. Griffin followed her gaze to see the old fisherman making his way carefully along the shore path, a paper lantern clutched in his gnarled hands. Frank moved with the stiffness of age and hard physical labor, but his back remained straight, his eyes fixed on the path ahead. "Let me approach him first," Griffin said. "He's more likely to talk if he doesn't feel ambushed." Abigail agreed, remaining by the lighthouse as Griffin descended the path to intercept Frank, before he reached the main gathering area. "Evening, Frank," Griffin greeted, keeping his tone casual, though his purpose was anything but. The old fisherman looked up sharply, wariness entering his weathered features when he spotted Griffin. "Griffin, come to pay respects." "Yes," and to talk." Griffin nodded toward a nearby bench positioned to overlook the harbor. "Got a few minutes before the ceremony starts." Frank hesitated, clutching his lantern, which Griffin could now see bore the name Samuel Mercer more tightly. "Nothing to talk about that we haven't already covered." "I found a piece of the trident," Griffin said quietly. "Recently, in waters where it shouldn't be." The color drained from Frank's face. "That's not possible." "Yet it happened, and it's not the only new development." Griffin gestured toward the bench again. "Please, Frank, for my father's sake, for all those who died on the trident." The appeal worked. Frank's shoulders slumped slightly as he nodded, following Griffin to the bench and lowering himself onto it with a soft grunt of discomfort. "What did you find?" he asked, his voice barely audible above the gentle lap of waves against the rocky shore. Griffin described the wood fragment with the trident emblem recovered during the Northern Star rescue. Frank listened without interruption, his gnarled hands working restlessly against the paper lantern in his lap. "Could be coincidence," the old fisherman said when Griffin finished. "Piece of driftwood, carved similar, that's all." "It's from the trident bearers, Frank. We both know it." Griffin leaned closer. "Just as we both know you were on board when she went down. What I don't understand is why there's no record of your survival. Why you've kept silent all these years about what really happened." Frank's eyes faded with age, but still sharp flicked toward the lighthouse where Abigail waited. "Because of her kind. Because some powerful folks wanted the truth, buried alongside those ships." "Her kind? You mean Abigail Winters?" Frank nodded, his expression grim. "Daughter of James Winters, first officer on the Atlantic venture. Man who started asking questions that got a lot of people killed." The confirmation of Abigail's connection to the Atlantic venture wasn't surprising given what they'd already discovered, but Frank's phrasing caught Griffin's attention. "Questions about what, Frank?" The old fisherman shook his head. "Don't matter now. Ancient history." "It matters to me," Griffin insisted. "It matters to Abigail. We both lost our fathers to these accidents that you're implying weren't accidents at all." Frank was silent for a long moment, staring out at the harbor where boats continued to gather for the ceremony. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of secrets long kept. "Your father was a good man, Griffin. Best captain I ever sailed under. He tried to do right by everyone, including James Winters." Frank sighed heavily. "But he trusted the wrong people. We all did." "Chester Harrison?" Frank's head snapped up, surprise evident. "You know about Harrison. I know he was my father's former business partner. I know his company employed James Winters. And I know Malcolm Reynolds worked for Harrison before founding Neptune Shipping." Frank's expression darkened at the mention of Reynolds. "That snake. Should have known he'd slither his way to the top eventually." "What happened, Frank?" Griffin pressed, sensing the old fisherman was finally close to revealing what he knew. "What really happened to the trident?" Frank studied Griffin for a long moment, as if weighing decades of silence against the need for truth. Finally, he glanced toward the gathering crowd, now numbering close to 100, as the sun dipped lower toward the horizon. "Not here," he said, his voice low. "Too many ears. Too many people who still live in Port Haven, whose lives could be upended by old truths." He hesitated, then added, "After the ceremony, my place. Bring the girl if you must, but no one else." Relief mingled with anticipation in Griffin's chest. "Thank you, Frank." The old fisherman shook his head. "Don't thank me yet. What I know won't bring you peace, son. Won't bring her peace either. Some truths just bring more pain." Before Griffin could respond, the lighthouse keeper emerged from the cottage ringing the traditional bronze bell that signaled the ceremony's beginning. Frank stood clutching Samuel Mercer's lantern. "Best join the others," he said. "Pay proper respects before we dig up the dead." Griffin nodded, watching as Frank made his way toward the gathering. Once the old fisherman was out of earshot, Abigail approached, concern evident in her expression. "What did he say?" she asked. "I saw your expressions change, but couldn't hear anything." "He's agreed to tell us everything," Griffin replied, "after the ceremony at his home." Abigail's eyes widened slightly. "Really? After all this resistance?" Finding that piece of the trident shook him. "And I think—" Griffin hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "I think he's carried this burden long enough. 25 years is a long time to keep secrets of this magnitude." Abigail nodded, looking toward where Frank now stood at the edge of the gathering, apart from the family groups, but still part of the community ritual. "He launches a lantern for your father every year." "Yes, I never understood why. Now I think it might be guilt or some sense of obligation to the man who was his captain." They joined the main group as the lighthouse keeper began the traditional reading, a simple poem about those who go to sea, followed by a recitation of names being honored that year. Port Haven had lost no one to the sea in the past 12 months, so the list consisted entirely of historical losses: fathers, grandfathers, great-grandfathers, whose families maintained the remembrance tradition generations later. When Samuel Mercer's name was called, both Frank and Griffin stepped forward to place their lanterns on the launching platform, a floating dock extended specifically for the ceremony. The duplicate tribute raised a few eyebrows, but in the solemn atmosphere, no one commented. Abigail remained slightly behind Griffin, holding her blue lantern for James Winters. When the keeper reached the end of his prepared list, he asked, as was tradition, "Are there others to be remembered this night?" Griffin glanced at Abigail, who hesitated briefly before stepping forward. "James Winters," she said clearly, "first officer of the Atlantic Venture, lost at sea 1989. A murmur rippled through the crowd. The Atlantic Venture wasn't a Port Haven vessel, and James Winters had no known connection to the community. Yet no one would deny remembrance at this ceremony, regardless of the circumstances. The keeper nodded solemnly, adding the name to his list before beginning the final blessing. As he spoke, the lighthouse beam activated, sweeping across the gathering darkness in its familiar rhythm. At this signal, attendants moved along the launching platform, lighting each paper lantern with long tapers. One by one, the lanterns began to glow from within, illuminating the names inscribed on their surfaces. When all were lit, the keeper rang the bronze bell once more, and the platform was gently lowered into the water. Freed from their moorings, the lanterns began to drift with the outgoing tide, a constellation of remembrance moving slowly toward the harbor entrance. Tradition held that souls lost at sea guided the lanterns safely to the horizon, accepting the honor and remembrance they carried. Griffin stood beside Abigail, watching as the 3 lanterns bearing their father's names joined the procession of light across the dark water. The simple beauty of the ceremony always affected him deeply, but tonight carried additional weight, with the knowledge that answers about his father's death might finally be forthcoming. Beside him, Abigail wiped away a tear, her composure momentarily slipping, as she watched her father's lantern drift among the others. Without thinking, Griffin placed a supportive hand on her shoulder. She glanced up at him with a grateful smile, the shared moment transcending their business arrangement and investigation partnership. As the lanterns reached the harbor entrance, disappearing one by one into the greater darkness beyond, Griffin noticed Frank Calloway slipping away from the gathering, heading toward the path that led back to town. The old fisherman moved with purpose, his duty to Samuel Mercer apparently fulfilled for another year. "He's leaving," Griffin murmured to Abigail. We should follow soon. He's not a man who likes to be kept waiting." Abigail nodded, her gaze still on the distant lights. "Just another moment," she requested softly. "I've never been able to do this for my father before. Never had a proper way to say goodbye." Griffin understood completely. He'd attended the remembrance ceremony every year since his father's death, finding solace in the ritual even when answers remained elusive. He waited patiently beside Abigail until the last lantern disappeared from view, respecting her need for this moment of connection and closure. Only then did they turn away from the water, making their way back toward the parking area as the crowd began to disperse. The mood was subdued, but not somber, the ceremony providing a release of lingering grief rather than reopening emotional wounds. "Are you ready for this?" Griffin asked as they reached his truck. Frank implied the truth isn't pleasant. Abigail's expression was resolute in the dim light. "I've spent most of my life not knowing what really happened to my father. Whatever the truth is, it's better than uncertainty." Griffin wasn't entirely sure he agreed. Some truths could indeed be more painful than not knowing, but he respected her determination. They drove in companionable silence through Port Haven's quiet streets toward Frank's modest home near the southern harbor. Lights burned in the front windows as they arrived, suggesting Frank was expecting them despite his usual early bedtime. Griffin led the way to the door, knocking firmly. When Frank opened the door, his expression was grim but resigned. "Come in, then," he said without preamble. "Got coffee made. Might need something stronger before we're done, but coffee's a start." They followed him into the small living room Griffin had visited before. Frank had clearly prepared for their arrival. The usually cluttered space was tidier, with 3 mugs and a coffee pot arranged on the side table. A leather-bound logbook that Griffin didn't recognize lay on the coffee table, its worn cover suggesting frequent handling over many years. "Miss Winters?" Frank acknowledged Abigail with a cautious nod as they settled into the available chairs. "You look like your father. Same eyes, same way of holding yourself." Abigail seemed startled by the personal observation. "You knew my father well." "Well enough," Frank replied cryptically, pouring coffee into the waiting mugs. "Served with him briefly aboard the Northern Star before he transferred to the Atlantic Venture. Dedicated officer, asked too many questions for his own good." He handed them each a mug before settling into his armchair, his gnarled hands wrapped around his own coffee as if drawing strength from its warmth. "Before I start," Frank said, his gaze shifting between Griffin and Abigail, "you both need to understand something. What I'm about to tell you can't be undone, can't be unheard. Might change how you see your fathers, might change how you see Port Haven itself. You sure you want that burden?" Griffin and Abigail exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. Then, almost in unison, they nodded. "We're sure," Griffin confirmed. "Whatever the truth is, we need to know it." Frank sighed deeply, reaching for the logbook on the coffee table. "Then I'll start at the beginning, with Harrison shipping container number 7 and the secret that killed 17 good men aboard the Trident and 14 more on the Atlantic Venture months earlier." As Frank opened the logbook to begin his account, a flash of lightning illuminated the windows, followed seconds later by a rumble of thunder. A spring storm was rolling in from the Atlantic, as if nature itself recognized the gravity of long-buried secrets finally rising to the surface. Frank Calloway's revelation was interrupted before it could begin. A sharp knock at the door caused the old fisherman to freeze, his weathered hand still resting on the logbook cover. His eyes, suddenly alert with alarm, darted to the window. "Expecting anyone else?" Griffin asked, instantly on guard. Frank shook his head, rising slowly from his chair. "No one knows you're here. No one should know I'm back yet," came straight from the ceremony. Another knock, more insistent this time. Frank moved to the window, carefully peering through a gap in the curtains. His body tensed visibly. "Neptune shipping," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Two men in suits. Don't recognize them." Abigail exchanged a concerned glance with Griffin. "Reynolds?" "Can't see clearly," Frank replied. "But fancy car out front, black sedan." Griffin moved silently to Frank's side, looking through the curtain gap. Two men stood on the porch, younger than Reynolds, professionally dressed, despite the late hour, with the unmistakable alertness of security personnel rather than business executives. "Not Reynolds himself," Griffin confirmed, "but definitely his people." The knocking came again, followed by a male voice. "Mr. Calloway, David Chun from Neptune Shipping. Mr. Reynolds sends his regards and would appreciate a moment of your time." Frank's face had gone pale beneath his weathered tan. "They know," he whispered. "After all these years, they know I'm going to talk." "How could they?" Abigail asked, keeping her voice low. Unless they've been watching Frank since Reynolds arrived in Port Haven." Griffin finished, his mind racing through possibilities. "Or they saw us at the ceremony and followed us here." Frank moved away from the window, gathering the logbook and shoving it into Griffin's hands. "Take this. Get out the back way. There's a path through the garden that leads to the old maintenance road. They won't see you leave." "We're not leaving you to face them alone," Griffin objected. "You have to," Frank insisted. "That book contains everything, my personal log from the Trident, notes I've kept for 25 years, evidence about what really happened. If they get hold of it, truth dies with me." "Mr. Calloway," the voice came again, more insistent. "We know you're home. The lights are on and your truck is in the driveway." Griffin made a swift decision. "Abigail, go with Frank out the back. Take the logbook, get to your car. I'll deal with Reynolds's men, buy you some time." "What about you?" Abigail asked, concern evident in her expression. "I own half this town," Griffin replied with grim confidence. "They can't touch me without consequences. Go now." Frank hesitated only briefly before nodding in agreement. "This way," he told Abigail, leading her toward the kitchen and the back door beyond. Once they had disappeared from view, Griffin straightened his posture, adopting the commanding presence that had made him Port Haven's most influential figure. He opened the front door with deliberate calm, filling the doorway with his imposing frame. "Gentlemen," he greeted the startled men on the porch. "Griffin Mercer. I don't believe we've been properly introduced, though I recognize you from yesterday's festival." The men recovered quickly from their surprise. The one who had spoken, David Chun, according to his introduction, offered a practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Mercer, unexpected to find you here. We were hoping to speak with Mr. Calloway on a private matter." "Frank's not available," Griffin said firmly. "He's had a long day with the remembrance ceremony. As a close family friend, I suggested he rest. Perhaps you could return during business hours tomorrow." Chun exchanged glances with his companion, clearly reassessing the situation. Of course, though Mr. Reynolds was particularly interested in speaking with Mr. Calloway this evening, a potential opportunity for someone with his extensive maritime experience. "I'm sure any legitimate business opportunity can wait until morning," Griffin replied, emphasizing the word legitimate ever so slightly. The implied challenge hung in the air between them. Chun's companion, younger, with the hard eyes of someone accustomed to intimidation, shifted his weight subtly, a hand moving toward the inside of his jacket. Griffin noticed the movement and smiled coldly. "Port Haven values its privacy and community bonds, gentlemen. Neptune Shipping would do well to respect that if you hope to conduct business here." "Of course," Chun replied smoothly, placing a restraining hand on his companion's arm. We'll connect with Mr. Calloway tomorrow. Please convey Mr. Reynolds' regards. Griffin maintained his position in the doorway, watching as the men returned to their sedan. Only when they had driven away did he allow himself a moment of tension release, shoulders lowering slightly as he considered the implications of their visit. Reynolds knew. Somehow he knew they were closing in on the truth about the shipwrecks. The timing of his arrival in Port Haven, his interest in Harborview Inn, and now this late-night visit to Frank's home all pointed to a concerted effort to control information about events 25 years in the past. Griffin pulled out his phone, calling Abigail. She answered on the first ring. "They're gone," he told her. "For now, where are you?" "Just reaching my car," she replied, her voice slightly breathless. "Frank is with me. He's not doing well, Griffin. The shock of seeing Neptune's people at his door seems to have affected him physically." "Get him to Harborview," Griffin instructed. "Use the service entrance. I'll meet you there in 20 minutes. We need a secure location to continue this conversation, and your inn is the last place Reynolds would expect us to gather." After ending the call, Griffin conducted a quick search of Frank's home, looking for anything the old fisherman might have left behind that could provide Reynolds with information. Finding nothing obvious, he locked the house and made his way to his truck, mind racing with implications and possible next steps. The storm that had threatened during the remembrance ceremony was now moving in earnest sheets of rain, obscuring visibility as Griffin drove carefully toward Harborview Inn. The weather matched his mood, dark, turbulent, with forces beyond his control, threatening the stability he'd worked so hard to maintain. Yet beneath the concern lay a current of anticipation. After 25 years, he was finally closing in on the truth about his father's death. Whatever dangers that truth might bring, whatever revelations might shake his understanding of the past, Griffin was determined to face them head-on, for his father's memory, for Port Haven's future, and increasingly for Abigail, whose quest for answers had become intertwined with his own in ways he hadn't anticipated when she first arrived in town. The storm intensified as Griffin pulled into Harborview's private parking area, rain hammering against his windshield and thunder rumbling overhead. An appropriate backdrop, he thought grimly, for the long-buried secrets that were about to surface. Harborview Inn stood resolute against the storm, its renovated Victorian facade illuminated briefly by flashes of lightning. Griffin parked beside Abigail's car in the service area and hurried through the rain to the kitchen entrance she had indicated would be unlocked. The inn's modern kitchen gleamed with stainless steel and polished stone, a stark contrast to the building's historic exterior. Griffin followed the sound of voices to a small office adjacent to the kitchen, where he found Abigail kneeling beside Frank Calloway. The old fisherman sat in an armchair, his weathered face ashen, a glass of amber liquid clutched in trembling hands. "How is he?" Griffin asked, closing the door behind him. "Better now," Abigail replied, standing to make room for Griffin. The shock and the quick escape took more out of him than he expected. Frank looked up, his eyes clearer than they had been during their hasty departure from his home. "I'm not dead yet," he said gruffly. "Just reminded that I'm not 20 anymore." "Did Reynolds' men follow you?" Griffin asked Abigail. She shook her head. "I took precautions, doubled back, changed routes. I don't think we were followed." "They'll check here eventually," Griffin warned. "It's an obvious connection to you." "Not tonight," Abigail said confidently. "The inn is officially closed for renovations. All contractors are gone by 6, and we've made a point of keeping all lights off in the main building during evening hours. As far as anyone knows, I'm staying at the Harbor Motel, while my private quarters here are being renovated." Griffin nodded approval at her foresight. "Where's the logbook?" Abigail retrieved a canvas bag from beside her desk. removing Frank's leather-bound journal and placing it on the desk's surface. Frank was just about to explain its significance when you arrived. All eyes turned to the old fisherman, who took a fortifying sip of what Griffin now recognized as fine bourbon before setting his glass aside. "Started keeping that log when I first signed on with the Trident, Frank explained. "Unofficial personal record. Samuel, your father, knew about it, encouraged it even. Said a good seaman keeps his own accounting alongside the official one." Griffin felt a surge of emotion at this small insight into his father's character, a detail no one had shared with him before. "The official log of the Trident went down with the ship," Frank continued. "But mine survived because I wasn't on board when she sank." Griffin frowned. "But you were listed on the crew manifest. Everyone believed you died with the others." Frank nodded, his expression grim. "That's what they were supposed to believe. What everyone was supposed to believe." He leaned forward, his voice dropping despite the privacy of their location. "Your father transferred me to shore duty the day before the Trident's final voyage. No paperwork, no official record, just a handshake and instructions to wait for his return." "Wait," Griffin asked, struggling to understand. "Why the secrecy?" "Because Samuel Mercer had discovered something dangerous," Frank replied, "something worth killing for. He needed someone outside the system, someone who could act if anything happened to him." Frank gestured toward the logbook. "It's all in there. The cargo discrepancies James Winters noticed on the Atlantic venture. The pattern your father identified across multiple Harrison shipping vessels. The evidence they gathered planning to take to the authorities." Abigail opened the logbook, carefully revealing pages of neat handwriting interspersed with what appeared to be photocopied documents, manifests, route maps, schedules. "Weapons," Frank said flatly. "Military-grade weapons being shipped illegally to conflict zones under the cover of legitimate cargo. Harrison Shipping was making millions on the side, delivering death to regions under international embargo." Griffin absorbed this revelation, struggling to connect it to the shipwrecks. "My father discovered this smuggling operation." "James Winters discovered it first," Frank corrected, nodding toward Abigail. "Your father noticed discrepancies on manifest documents, weights that didn't match contents, containers loaded with unusual security. He reported to his captain, who dismissed his concerns. That's when he reached out to Samuel Mercer, who had a reputation for integrity." Abigail was scanning the logbook pages rapidly. "This matches what was in my father's journal," she confirmed. "The meeting with Captain Mercer, the plans to document everything for the shipping authorities. But the Atlantic venture went down before they could report anything." Griffin said, the pieces beginning to align in his mind. Frank's expression darkened. "It was no accident. Neither storm was natural, not in the way the reports claimed. The Atlantic venture was sabotaged. When your father started his own investigation after meeting with James Winters, the Trident was targeted too." "Sabotaged how?" Griffin demanded, an old anger rising within him. "Explosives," Frank said bluntly. "Small charges placed on the hull below the waterline, detonated remotely once the ships were in open water during storms when structural failure would seem plausible. The weather provided cover for murder." The brutal truth landed like a physical blow. Griffin had spent 25 years believing his father died in a tragic accident. To learn it had been deliberate murder, cold, calculated, disguised as an act of nature, awakened a fury he had not experienced since the raw days following Samuel Mercer's death. "Who?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Who gave the orders?" Frank reached for his bourbon again, his hand steadier now as the familiar territory of his long-held secrets unfolded. "Harrison, ultimately. But he needed someone to execute the plan, someone ruthless enough to arrange the deaths of innocent crews to protect the operation. "Reynolds," Abigail said, looking up from the logbook. Frank nodded. "Malcolm Reynolds, Harrison's security chief at the time. Young, ambitious, willing to do whatever it took to advance. He personally placed the charges on both vessels." Griffin's mind raced through implications. Harrison died shortly after the Trident was lost. Car accident, if I remember correctly. A harsh laugh escaped Frank. No more an accident than the shipwrecks. Reynolds eliminated Harrison once he had enough evidence to control the smuggling operation himself. Staged the car crash, took over as security director, then systematically removed anyone who might have known about the weapons shipments, and built Neptune shipping from the ashes of Harrison's operation. Griffin concluded the full scope of Reynolds's crimes becoming clear. 25 years of profit built on murder. But why come to Port Haven now? Abigail asked the crucial question hanging between them. After all this time, why risk exposing himself by returning to the scene? Frank turned to Griffin. "Because of you, son. You found that piece of the Trident. Word travels in maritime circles. Reynolds has informants throughout the shipping industry. When he heard Griffin Mercer had recovered debris that might be from his father's vessel, he knew the risk of exposure had returned. And then I arrived in Port Haven," Abigail added, understanding dawning in her expression. "Daughter of James Winters buying property in the town controlled by Samuel Mercer's son. From Reynolds's perspective, it would look like we were working together, perhaps already knew the truth." "Which we weren't," Griffin noted. "Until now. Doesn't matter what was true," Frank said wearily. "Only what Reynolds believed might be true. He couldn't risk the past resurfacing, not with what he's built. Neptune Shipping is now a publicly traded company worth billions. Reynolds sits on international maritime boards, donates to political campaigns, moves in elite circles. The revelation that his empire began with mass murder would destroy everything." Griffin studied the old fisherman with new understanding. "This is why you've kept silent all these years. You feared Reynolds would come after you if you spoke out." Frank nodded, shame evident in his downcast eyes. "At first, yes. I was a coward. By the time I worked up the courage to come forward, years had passed. Evidence had disappeared. Reynolds had gained power and influence. Who would believe an aging fisherman against a respected business leader? But you kept the logbook," Abigail observed. "All these years you preserved the evidence." "For this day," Frank confirmed. "I always knew someday either you or Griffin would come asking questions. I owed that much to your fathers." Thunder rumbled overhead, a reminder of the storm that continued to batter Port Haven. In the small office, another kind of storm was brewing as Griffin and Abigail processed the terrible revelations about their fathers' deaths. "What do we do now?" Abigail asked, looking between Griffin and Frank. "Reynolds knows we're getting close to the truth. His men came looking for Frank tonight. They won't stop there." Griffin's expression hardened with determination. "We take this evidence to the authorities. The FBI handles international weapons smuggling. With Frank's testimony and the documentation in the logbook, they should have enough to open an investigation into Reynolds." "It won't be that simple," Frank cautioned. "Reynolds has political connections, high-priced lawyers, and the crimes happened 25 years ago. Statutes of limitations don't apply to murder," Griffin interrupted. "And while weapons smuggling charges might be time-barred, the murders of 31 people aboard those ships aren't." Abigail had been examining the logbook more carefully. "There's more," she said, her voice tight with controlled emotion. Frank, you've made notes about additional shipments after the Trident went down. Routes, dates, container numbers. Frank nodded grimly. Reynolds continued the operation after taking control. I kept tracking manifests, comparing shipping records, documenting patterns that matched what your fathers had discovered. The weapons shipments continued for at least a decade after the sinkings. Then we may have evidence of more recent crimes, Griffin said, hope rising. International arms trafficking has no statute of limitations under certain circumstances. But we still have the immediate problem, Abigail pointed out. Reynolds is here in Port Haven. His men are looking for Frank, and they'll check here eventually regardless of how careful we've been. Griffin considered their options, the strategic part of his mind, analyzing risks and contingencies. We need to get Frank and the evidence somewhere safe until we can connect with federal authorities. Not in Port Haven. Reynolds has too many eyes here now. I have a colleague in the Boston FBI field office, Abigail offered. Someone I trust from a previous financial investigation. I can reach out first thing in the morning. That may be too late, Griffin replied, checking his watch. It was nearly midnight. Reynolds's men will regroup, report back. By morning, they'll have expanded their search. Frank straightened in his chair, a new resolve evident in his bearing. I know a place. Old fishing cabin on Quarry Island about 3 miles offshore. Belonged to a friend who passed last year. No one knows I have the key, or that I sometimes use it when I want true solitude. Quarry Island, Griffin repeated, mentally mapping the location. Isolated, defensible, accessible only by boat. It could work for a temporary safe house. My thoughts exactly, Frank agreed. Get me there with the logbook. I'll lay low until you can arrange proper federal protection. I'll take you, Griffin decided. My personal vessel is moored at the private dock behind my house. Fully fueled, equipped for all weather. We can leave within the hour. In this storm? Abigail asked, concern evident in her voice, as another thunderclap punctuated her question. I've navigated worse, Griffin assured her. The lightning is moving offshore, and the wind is manageable for a vessel of Redemption's size. I'm coming with you, Abigail stated, her tone brooking no argument. Griffin started to object, then reconsidered. Leaving Abigail behind might place her in greater danger if Reynolds's men connected her to Frank's disappearance, and her presence would allow him to ensure her safety personally. Fine, he conceded, but we need to move quickly and quietly. Reynolds won't expect us to leave Port Haven by sea in these conditions. Frank gathered the logbook, securing it in the canvas bag Abigail provided. What about after? He asked. Once I'm safely on Quarry Island, what's your plan? I'll make contact with my FBI connection, Abigail said. Arrange for them to meet us either at the island or a secure location on the mainland. And I'll gather additional evidence from my father's records, Griffin added. There may be correspondence or documents that corroborate what's in your logbook. As they prepared to depart, Griffin pulled Abigail aside while Frank used the restroom. Are you certain about this? He asked quietly. Once we take Frank to that island, we're fully committed. Reynolds will know we've chosen sides. Abigail met his gaze steadily. I chose my side 25 years ago when my father died uncovering this conspiracy. I just didn't know it until now. Her hand found his arm, the touch conveying determination and something more personal. We're in this together, Griffin, all the way. The simple declaration affected Griffin more deeply than he had anticipated. In the brief time since Abigail had arrived in Port Haven, she had evolved from potential threat to reluctant ally to something he wasn't quite ready to name, but felt with increasing clarity. All the way, he echoed, sealing their pact. The storm had moderated slightly by the time they reached Griffin's private dock, though rain still fell steadily and the wind gusted unpredictably. The Redemption, a 40-foot motor yacht equipped for both pleasure and practical use, rocked gently at its mooring, its white hull gleaming dully in the security lighting. Griffin helped Frank and Abigail aboard before casting off the lines and taking position at the helm. Despite his age and earlier distress, Frank moved with the sure-footed confidence of a lifelong seaman, assisting with preparations, while Abigail secured their small cache of supplies and the precious logbook below deck. The Redemption slipped away from the dock with minimal noise, her engines powerful but well-maintained to operate quietly when needed. Griffin kept the running lights off until they cleared the inner harbor, relying on his intimate knowledge of Port Haven's waters and the vessel's sophisticated radar system to navigate safely. Neptune's yacht is still moored at the guest dock, Frank observed from his position beside Griffin in the wheelhouse. No lights. Reynolds must be ashore. Probably at the Harbor Hotel, Griffin replied. It's where visiting executives usually stay. His men will be searching for us, Abigail said, joining them after stowing their gear. Will they think to watch the harbor? Eventually, Griffin acknowledged. But we have the advantage of timing and weather. No one expects boat movements during a storm at midnight. By the time they think to check the marinas and docks, we'll be safely at Quarry Island. The Redemption passed the harbor entrance meeting the more substantial swells of the open Atlantic. Griffin adjusted course, the vessel responding smoothly to his commands as they headed northeast toward the small archipelago that included Quarry Island. Abigail braced herself against the increased motion, but showed no signs of discomfort with the rough conditions. "How long to reach the island?" she asked. "About 40 minutes in these conditions," Griffin answered. "Longer than usual, but I'm taking a more circuitous route as a precaution." Frank had moved to the radar display, his experienced eye scanning for other vessels. "All clear so far," he reported. "No marine traffic within 5 miles." The journey continued in focused silence, each occupied with their own thoughts, as the Redemption pushed through the storm-tossed waters. Griffin maintained a vigilant watch, dividing his attention between navigation and periodic checks of their surroundings for any sign of pursuit. Quarry Island emerged from the darkness approximately 40 minutes later, a low rocky mass rising from the churning waters. Unlike many of Maine's scenic islands, Quarry Island had a rougher, more utilitarian history. Named for the small granite quarry that had operated there until the 1950s, it had been largely abandoned since commercial operations ceased, visited only occasionally by local fishermen seeking shelter or solitude. "There," Frank directed, pointing toward a small cove on the island's western side. "Cabins just up from that natural harbor. There's a mooring buoy about 30 yards in." Griffin adjusted course, approaching the sheltered cove carefully. The island provided a welcome break from the wind, making the final approach smoother as Frank located the mooring buoy with a spotlight. "I'll take the skiff," Frank said once the Redemption was securely moored. "Cabin's about 200 yards up that path. I'll get things ready, then signal with the lantern when it's safe to bring Ms. Winters ashore." Griffin nodded agreement. Despite the improved conditions in the lee of the island, transferring everyone at once in the small tender would be unnecessarily risky. Frank lowered himself into the skiff with the practiced ease of someone who had spent a lifetime moving between vessels, taking the canvas bag containing his logbook with him. "Be careful," Abigail called softly as Frank began rowing toward shore. The old fisherman acknowledged her concern with a wave, before turning his full attention to navigating the small craft through the remaining swells. Griffin and Abigail watched from the Redemption's stern as Frank reached the rocky beach, secured the skiff, and began making his way up a barely visible path that led into the island's interior. "He's more resilient than he appears," Griffin observed. Most men his age would be overwhelmed by tonight's events. Guilt is a powerful motivator, Abigail replied. He's carried the weight of his silence for 25 years. This is his chance at redemption. They lost sight of Frank as he disappeared among the island's scrubby vegetation. The minutes stretched on, punctuated only by the sound of waves against the hull and the occasional distant rumble of thunder as the storm continued its passage out to sea. "Do you regret coming to Port Haven?" Griffin asked suddenly, the question emerging from thoughts that had been forming since Frank's revelations. Abigail considered this her profile thoughtful in the dim light. "No," she said finally. "I came seeking answers about my father's death. I found them, though they are more terrible than I imagined. But I also found—" She hesitated, glancing at Griffin. "Other things I wasn't expecting." The unspoken acknowledgement of their evolving connection hung between them, neither quite ready to define it aloud, but both increasingly aware of its presence. "When this is over," Griffin began, then paused, reformulating his thoughts. "If we succeed in bringing Reynolds to justice, what then? For Harborview Inn, for your plans in Port Haven?" "I meant what I said before," Abigail replied. "Harborview is a legitimate business venture, not just a cover for my investigation. I still believe in its potential in what it could mean for Port Haven's future." She turned to face him fully. "The question is whether you'll still want outside influence in your town once this crisis has passed." Griffin recognized the challenge in her question, a reference to his initial resistance to her presence, and the control he had historically maintained over Port Haven's development. "I'm discovering that some influences can strengthen rather than threaten what matters," he said carefully. "Port Haven has been my responsibility for so long, I sometimes forget it can benefit from new perspectives, from people who care about its character as much as I do." Abigail's expression softened, a smile touching her lips. "That sounds remarkably like Griffin Mercer admitting he might have been wrong about something." "Don't get used to it," he replied, with a rare hint of humor. "It's a limited-time occurrence." Their moment of connection was interrupted by a flash of light from the direction of the cabin. 3 short bursts followed by one long, the predetermined signal that Frank had secured the location. "That's our cue," Griffin said, moving to prepare the skiff for their journey ashore. "Let's get you to safety, then I'll secure the redemption for the night." The transfer to shore proceeded smoothly, Abigail maintaining her balance in the small craft despite the residual swells. Griffin helped her onto the rocky beach, then secured the skiff beside Frank's, before leading the way up the path the old fisherman had taken earlier. The cabin materialized from the darkness, a simple structure of weathered wood, with a metal roof built to withstand the harsh conditions of coastal Maine winters. Light glowed from behind drawn curtains, and smoke rose from the stone chimney, suggesting Frank had already started a fire against the damp chill. Frank opened the door at their approach, ushering them quickly inside. The cabin's interior was basic, but comfortable, a main room with a wood stove, small kitchen area, and simple furniture, plus what appeared to be 2 small bedrooms off the main space. The air smelled of wood smoke and the lingering scent of fish, not unpleasant, but distinctly marking the space as a fisherman's retreat. "Got a fire going and found some canned supplies," Frank announced. "Not luxury accommodations, but it'll do until arrangements can be made with the authorities." "It's perfect," Abigail assured him, moving toward the wood stove's warmth. "Secure and isolated, exactly what we need." Griffin conducted a quick assessment of the cabin's defensive position. Single access path from the cove. Good visibility in all directions. When daylight came, solid construction that would withstand both weather and unwanted visitors. The location was as close to ideal as they could hope for under the circumstances. "I'll bring in additional supplies from the redemption before securing her for the night," Griffin said. "Basic provisions, Emergency equipment. My satellite phone for secure communications. I'll help, Abigail offered, but Griffin shook his head. Stay with Frank. Begin organizing the evidence from his logbook, identifying the most compelling documentation for your FBI contact. I'll handle the boat. Frank had already spread his logbook and additional papers on the cabin's small table. Might as well make use of our time, he agreed. Got 25 years of notes to sort through. Griffin departed, retracing his steps to the cove where the skiff waited. The physical activity of rowing back to the Redemption and gathering necessary supplies provided a welcome outlet for the tension that had built throughout the evening. By the time he returned to the cabin with the first load of provisions, he had processed some of the anger that had threatened to overwhelm him when he learned the truth about his father's murder. Samuel Mercer had died because he chose integrity over safety, justice, over self-preservation. He had uncovered a deadly conspiracy and acted to expose it, knowing the risks, but proceeding anyway. It was a legacy Griffin hadn't fully understood until now, a standard of moral courage that both humbled and inspired him. Over the next hour, Griffin completed several trips between the Redemption and the cabin, transferring food, fresh water, medical supplies, blankets, and communications equipment. By the time he finished, the storm had largely passed, leaving behind a steady drizzle and occasional gusts of wind that seemed mild compared to the earlier tempest. Inside the cabin, Abigail and Frank had made significant progress organizing the evidence. The table was covered with neatly arranged documents, shipping manifests, comparative weight records, port authority filings, and Frank's meticulous notes tracking suspicious cargo movements over decades. We've identified the strongest evidence, Abigail reported as Griffin joined them after his final trip. Frank has documented at least 7 weapons shipments that occurred within the last 15 years, complete with container numbers, vessels, and destinations that match areas under international arms embargoes. Plus the original documentation regarding the Atlantic Venture and Trident incidents, Frank added, including mechanical inspections conducted before their final voyages, showing both vessels were in excellent condition before they mysteriously developed hull breaches during storms. Griffin reviewed their work, impressed with the thoroughness of both Frank's long-term documentation and Abigail's efficient organization. This should be more than enough to launch a federal investigation, he agreed, particularly with Frank's eyewitness testimony regarding Reynolds's involvement. I'll contact my FBI connection first thing in the morning, Abigail said. Special Agent Diana Chen. We worked together on a financial crimes case 2 years ago. She's trustworthy and has experience with complex investigations involving powerful figures. Griffin checked his watch, nearly 2 a.m. We should try to get some rest. Tomorrow will likely be challenging once Reynolds discovers Frank is missing. The cabin's 2 small bedrooms each contained simple twin beds with basic linens. By unspoken agreement, they assigned one room to Frank, whose age and earlier distress warranted the most comfortable accommodations available. Griffin insisted Abigail take the second bedroom, while he would make do with the worn sofa in the main room. I'll take first watch, he added, forestalling any objections. We're probably safe here, but I'd rather not take chances until federal authorities are involved. Frank nodded approval at the precaution before retiring to his assigned room, the events of the day clearly taking their toll on his endurance. Abigail lingered in the main room, reluctant to leave Griffin alone with his thoughts after all they had discovered. "Are you all right?" she asked quietly when Frank had closed his door. "Learning how your father really died, that can't be easy to process." Griffin considered deflecting the question with his usual stoicism, but found himself responding with unexpected honesty. "I always believed he died in an accident, a tragedy but without malice or intent. Knowing he was murdered, that his death was coldly planned by people he trusted. He shook his head, struggling to articulate the complex emotions. It changes things. It does, Abigail agreed, moving closer. For 25 years, I've carried a child's vague memories and an adult's questions about my father. Now I know he died because he chose to stand against something wrong, something evil. It doesn't lessen the loss, but it adds meaning to it. Meaning, Griffin repeated thoughtfully. Yes, that's part of it. My father died because of his integrity, his unwillingness to look away from injustice. That's a legacy I can honor, even as I grieve the way it was taken from him. Abigail placed a gentle hand on his arm, the simple contact conveying understanding words couldn't fully express. Get some rest yourself, she suggested. Wake me in a few hours. We can share the watch. Griffin nodded, though they both knew he was unlikely to sleep much, regardless. As Abigail moved toward her room, she paused at the doorway. For what it's worth, she said softly, I think your father would be proud of the man you've become, of what you've built in Port Haven, and how you've protected it. The simple validation touched something deep within Griffin, a question he had carried unacknowledged since his father's death. Would Samuel Mercer approve of his son's choices, his methods, the legacy he had created? Thank you, he replied, the words inadequate for the comfort they provided. After Abigail retired, Griffin positioned himself near the window that overlooked the path to the cove, his father's vintage Colt revolver retrieved from the Redemption's secure storage within easy reach. The storm had passed completely, now stars occasionally visible through breaks in the dissipating clouds. Alone with his thoughts, Griffin reflected on how dramatically his world had shifted in the weeks since Abigail Winters had arrived in Port Haven. What had begun as territorial concern over an outsider encroaching on his carefully controlled domain had evolved into something entirely unexpected, a partnership that challenged his assumptions, exposed long-buried truths, and awakened feelings he had never anticipated. Whatever tomorrow brought, whether justice for their fathers or new dangers from Reynolds's desperate attempts to protect his secrets, Griffin knew with certainty that Port Haven's future and his own had been irrevocably altered by the tide of revelations that had washed away 25 years of carefully maintained illusions. The first hints of dawn were lightening the eastern sky when Griffin heard it, the distant but unmistakable sound of a boat engine approaching the island. He moved quickly to the window, scanning the water visible through the trees. A sleek vessel was entering the cove. Its profile unfamiliar, but its purposeful approach raising immediate alarm. Griffin woke Abigail and Frank with quiet urgency, already retrieving the revolver and checking its chambers. "Someone's coming," he explained as they joined him in the main room. "Single vessel approaching from the south. Not local, the configuration is wrong for a fishing boat." Frank peered through the window, his expression grim. "That's a Neptune security craft. I recognize the design from when they visited Port Haven last year about potential dock leasing." "How did they find us?" Abigail asked quickly, gathering the most crucial evidence from the table. "Could have spotted the Redemption leaving harbor despite the storm," Frank suggested. "Or they might have been watching my place, followed you to the inn, then tracked your movements from there." Griffin made a swift tactical assessment. "They don't know we've seen them yet. The cabin is defensible, but we're outnumbered and likely outgunned. Our best option is to move deeper into the island, use the old quarry for cover until help arrives." "I know this island well," Frank said, pulling on his jacket. "There's a network of paths from the quarrying days. We can lose them in the interior if necessary." Abigail had already packed the essential evidence into the canvas bag, adding Griffin's satellite phone and some basic supplies. "I'll try to reach Agent Chen once we're in a secure position," she said. "The signal should be strong enough this close to the mainland." They slipped out the cabin's rear door just as the sound of the boat's engine cut off, indicating it had reached the shore. Griffin led the way, following Frank's whispered directions toward a less visible path that wound up through the island's central ridge. The morning mist hanging over the island provided both help and hindrance, concealing their movement from pursuers, but also limiting their own visibility. They moved as quickly as Frank's age, and the rough terrain allowed putting distance between themselves and the cabin where Reynolds's men would soon discover their quarry had fled. After 15 minutes of steady climbing, they reached a vantage point that allowed them to look back toward the cove. 3 men had disembarked from the vessel, professional-looking individuals whose body language and coordinated movements suggested military or security backgrounds. They had already reached the cabin and were presumably discovering it empty. "They'll start searching the island systematically," Griffin observed. "Standard grid pattern most likely. We need to reach the quarry before they organize a proper search." Frank nodded agreement, gesturing toward a narrow path that angled northeast. "This way. The old quarry is about half a mile ahead. Plenty of cover, multiple exit routes." They continued their journey now, moving with greater urgency as distant shouts indicated their pursuers had begun searching the surrounding area. The terrain grew rockier as they approached the abandoned quarry, requiring careful footing and reducing their pace. "How many access points does this quarry have?" Griffin asked Frank as they navigated a particularly challenging section. "3 main paths in and out," the old fisherman replied, "plus some smaller game trails, if you know where to look. The quarry itself is about 50 feet deep in sections with various levels and plenty of places to take cover." Abigail had been silent during their flight, focusing on maintaining her footing and keeping pace. Now she touched Griffin's arm, gesturing back the way they had come. "I think I saw movement on the ridge we just left," she said quietly. "They're tracking us." Griffin squinted through the thinning mist, catching a glimpse of a figure moving along the ridgeline approximately a quarter-mile behind them. "They're gaining ground. We need to reach the quarry and establish a defensive position." The abandoned quarry appeared before them suddenly, a massive gouge in the island's surface where granite had been extracted for decades before operations ceased. The morning sun, now rising above the horizon, cast long shadows across the stepped surfaces and debris piles, creating a labyrinth of light and darkness. Frank led them down a steep path into the quarry's main pit, navigating with the confidence of someone who had explored the area thoroughly. "There's a small shelter on the north face," he explained. "Old foreman's office. Solid stone construction, single-entrance window positions that allow visibility in multiple directions. The structure materialized from the quarry's complex geography, a low stone building partially recessed into the quarry wall, its weathered door hanging askew, but its overall construction still sound." Griffin conducted a quick inspection, confirming Frank's assessment of its defensive qualities. "This will work," he decided. "Abigail, try contacting Agent Chen now. Frank, help me secure that door and check what we can use to barricade the windows if necessary." While Abigail attempted to establish communications with her FBI contact, Griffin and Frank worked to improve their shelter's defensibility. The old door was reinforced with debris from around the quarry, and potential sniper positions were identified and noted for avoidance. "Agent Chen is on her way," Abigail reported after a brief satellite phone conversation. "She's mobilizing a tactical team from the Portland field office. ETA approximately 90 minutes. "And that's longer than I'd like, but better than we could have hoped," Griffin replied. "Did you explain the situation?" Abigail nodded. "Full brief on Reynolds, the weapons, smuggling, the murders. She's treating it as a highest priority situation, especially given Reynolds's current presence in the area and the active threat." A shout echoed across the quarry, indicating their pursuers had reached the rim and spotted signs of their passage. Griffin moved to a position where he could observe without being easily seen, tracking the movements of Neptune's security team. 3 men, as we saw earlier, he reported. They're spreading out to cover the main access points. Professional operation, not just hired muscle. Reynolds sent his best people. Makes sense, Frank said grimly. Too much at stake to trust amateurs. Griffin continued his assessment. They're armed handguns, visible, possibly additional weapons in their gear. They're being cautious, methodical. They know we're in the quarry, but not our exact position yet. Can we hold out until the FBI arrives? Abigail asked, joining Griffin at his observation point. If we stay hidden, possibly. If they discover our location and force a confrontation. He left the implication hanging. 1 revolver with limited ammunition against 3 well-armed professionals presented poor odds, regardless of their defensive position. Frank had been unusually quiet, his weathered face set in lines of deep thought. Now he straightened decision evident in his bearing. I need to draw them away from you two, he said firmly. I'm the one Reynolds wants most, the only living witness who can testify to his direct involvement in the Trident sabotage. If I create a diversion on the south side of the quarry, you can move toward the northeast exit and reach the FBI team as they land. Absolutely not, Griffin objected immediately. We stay together. It's tactical sense, son, Frank argued. I know this island better than anyone. I can keep them chasing shadows while you get the evidence and Ms. Winters to safety. It's too dangerous, Abigail insisted, joining Griffin's opposition. Reynolds's men won't hesitate to use lethal force if they corner you. Frank's expression softened as he looked between them. I've carried the weight of my silence for 25 years. Watched Reynolds build an empire on the graves of good men, your fathers included. If my final act can help bring him to justice, it's a price worth paying. The old fisherman's resolve was clear, his decision already made, despite their objections. Griffin recognized the same quality his father had possessed, a fundamental integrity that once engaged would not be swayed by personal risk. Take this, Griffin said, offering the revolver, and promise you'll avoid direct confrontation. Create the diversion, then find cover and wait for the FBI. Frank accepted the weapon with a nod of thanks. I'll need the logbook as well, he said. If something happens to me, they need to believe I have the evidence with me. Abigail hesitated, then removed several key pages from the logbook before handing the journal itself to Frank. These copies should be sufficient for the FBI to understand the scope, she explained. The originals stay with you. Frank tucked the logbook securely inside his jacket. Wait until you hear me drawing their attention to the south, he instructed. Then move quickly, but carefully toward the northeast path. It's less visible from the main quarry, offers good cover all the way to the eastern cove. Griffin clasped the old fisherman's shoulder, words inadequate for the moment. Frank nodded, understanding the unspoken gratitude and respect. Your father would be proud of you, Griffin, he said simply. Both of your fathers would be proud of what you're doing today. His gaze included Abigail in this assessment. Without further discussion, Frank slipped out of the stone shelter, moving with surprising agility for his age as he worked his way through the quarry's complex terrain toward the southern section. Griffin and Abigail waited in tense silence, each moment stretching, as they listened for signs of Frank's diversion. Finally, it came a gunshot, followed by shouting from the southern edge of the quarry. That's our signal, Griffin said, checking that Abigail had secured the evidence pages and satellite phone. Stay close, move only when I indicate it's clear. They emerged from the shelter, immediately seeking cover behind a large granite block as they oriented themselves toward the northeast exit Frank had described. The sounds of pursuit echoed from the southern quarry, multiple voices, movement through debris, occasional calls for surrender that indicated Frank had successfully drawn their attention. Griffin led their careful advance from cover to cover, always watching for signs of the third security operative, who might have remained in position rather than joining the pursuit of Frank. The northeast path gradually revealed itself a narrow track winding up the quarry wall that would have been nearly invisible without Frank's directions. They had almost reached it when a shot rang out closer than the ongoing commotion to the south. A bullet struck stone inches from Griffin's head, sending fragments flying. He pulled Abigail down behind the equipment remnant, scanning for the shooter. "Third man," he muttered, spotting movement on a ledge approximately 50 yards away. He stayed in position, covering the exits. "Can we reach the path?" Abigail asked, her composure remarkable under fire. Griffin assessed their position relative to the shooter's vantage point. "Not directly. We need to create our own diversion." On scanning their surroundings, Griffin identified a possible solution: an ancient cable drum once used for quarry operations positioned precariously on the slope above them. If dislodged, it would create substantial noise and movement, potentially drawing the shooter's attention long enough for them to reach the exit path. "When I move to dislodge that drum, be ready to run for the path," Griffin instructed. "Don't stop, don't look back. Just reach the trees beyond the quarry rim and keep moving toward the eastern cove." Abigail gripped his arm. "Together, Griffin. We do this together, or not at all." There was no time to argue. Another shot struck near their position, indicating the shooter was maneuvering for a clearer angle. Griffin nodded his agreement, and they formulated a swift plan. He would dislodge the cable drum, while Abigail provided covering movement to draw the shooter's eye. Then both would sprint for the exit path during the ensuing confusion. The plan executed with practiced coordination that belied their short acquaintance. Griffin heaved against the massive drum, while Abigail created motion in the opposite direction. The drum broke free, tumbling down the quarry face with a thunderous cacophony of metal and stone. The shooter's attention followed the dramatic movement, giving Griffin and Abigail precious seconds to sprint toward the northeast path. Bullets followed them as the shooter recovered from the distraction, but the angle was poor and their movement rapid. They reached the path and scrambled upward the rising quarry wall, soon providing cover from direct fire as they climbed toward the rim. Shouting behind them indicated the other security operatives had realized their quarry had split up. The pursuit would soon redirect, giving Frank some breathing room, but increasing the pressure on Griffin and Abigail's escape. They crested the quarry rim, finding themselves among the scrubby trees and undergrowth of the island's northeastern section. Griffin oriented quickly, identifying the path that would lead them toward the eastern cove, where the FBI team would likely make landfall. "This way," he directed, keeping their pace as rapid as the rough terrain allowed. "The cove is about half a mile ahead." They moved through the island's interior, the sounds of pursuit growing more distant, as the security team struggled to determine which exit they had taken from the quarry. The morning had fully dawned, now sunlight filtering through the trees and burning away the remaining mist. As they approached the eastern cove, Griffin used the satellite phone to contact Agent Chen, directly confirming their position and the tactical situation. The FBI team was approximately 20 minutes out, close enough to offer hope, far enough to maintain concern about their immediate safety. The eastern cove came into view, a small crescent of rocky beach facing the rising sun, the mainland visible as a dark line on the horizon. No boats were currently visible, either friendly or hostile, giving them a moment to catch their breath and assess their situation. "What about Frank?" Abigail asked, concern evident in her voice. "We can't just leave him." "We're not leaving him," Griffin assured her. "Once the FBI team arrives, we'll direct them to the quarry. Frank knows this island better than Reynolds' men. He'll evade capture until help arrives." A distant gunshot echoed across the island, followed by several more in rapid succession. Both froze, listening intently, but the brief exchange ended as suddenly as it had begun. "That came from the quarry," Griffin said, tension evident in his voice. "We need to—" He was interrupted by the sound of approaching engines, multiple vessels moving at high speed toward the cove. Seconds later, 3 boats appeared around the island's eastern point, 2 black Zodiac-style craft, with FBI clearly visible on their hulls, followed by a larger Coast Guard vessel. "Perfect timing," Abigail breathed relief evident in her voice. Griffin wasn't ready to relax. "The gunfire at the quarry, we need to make sure Frank is safe." As the FBI boats approached the shore, Griffin and Abigail moved down to the beach to meet them. Agent Chen, a compact, serious-looking woman in tactical gear, was first to disembark, immediately recognizing Abigail. "Ms. Winters," she greeted professionally. "Quite a situation you've uncovered. My team is securing the perimeter now." "There's an active threat at the quarry," Griffin explained rapidly. 3 armed Neptune security operatives pursuing a key witness. Gunfire reported less than 5 minutes ago. Chen immediately directed her team, dispatching 8 agents toward the quarry, while maintaining 4 at the landing site for security. "We'll find your witness," she assured them. "Meanwhile, I need to get you both to safety and secure that evidence." Abigail handed over the documents they had saved from Frank's logbook, quickly explaining their significance. "The complete logbook is with Frank Calloway, our witness. It contains 25 years of documentation about Reynolds's weapons smuggling operation and his connection to both shipwrecks. We have teams moving on Reynolds simultaneously in Port Haven," Chen informed them. "Based on your initial report, we secured emergency warrants for his arrest and seizure of Neptune's records. If your evidence supports the allegations, he won't be leaving federal custody anytime soon." This confirmation that justice was in motion should have provided satisfaction, but Griffin's thoughts remained with Frank. "I need to go with your team to the quarry," he insisted. "I know the layout, and Frank will trust me." Chen considered this briefly before nodding. "2 of my agents will accompany you. Ms. Winters remains here under protection until we've secured the entire island." Abigail started to object, but Griffin caught her eye. "Please," he said quietly. "Stay safe. I'll find Frank and bring him back." Something in his tone must have conveyed the depth of his concern, as Abigail nodded reluctantly. "Be careful," she replied. "Both of you come back safely." Griffin set off with the FBI agents, retracing their path toward the quarry with greater speed now that professional backup accompanied them. The island had fallen silent, the earlier gunfire not repeated, which could indicate either resolution or a more ominous development. They approached the quarry cautiously, the agents taking professional positions as they assessed the situation. The scene below appeared deserted at first glance, no movement visible among the stone blocks and debris piles of the abandoned worksite. Then Griffin spotted it, a figure slumped against a granite face near the southern section where Frank had led the security team. Even from a distance, he recognized Frank's distinctive jacket. "There," he pointed, already moving despite the agent's cautions about proper procedure. Griffin reached Frank first, finding the old fisherman conscious, but badly wounded, a bullet wound in his shoulder, and another that had grazed his temple, leaving a bloody trail down his weathered face. "Took 2 of them with me," Frank said weakly, as Griffin knelt beside him. "Third one ran when he heard the boats coming." "Save your strength," Griffin urged, applying pressure to the shoulder wound as the FBI agents radioed for medical support. "Help is here. You're going to be all right." Frank managed a pained smile. "Did what I should have done 25 years ago," he murmured. "Stood up to them. Your father would approve." The medical team arrived quickly, taking over Frank's care with professional efficiency. As they stabilized him for transport, Griffin retrieved the logbook, still secure inside Frank's jacket, the complete record of Reynolds's crimes preserved through the old fisherman's courage and determination. By the time they returned to the eastern cove, the situation had developed significantly. Agent Chen reported that Reynolds had been taken into custody in Port Haven while Neptune's yacht and offices were being searched by federal agents. Preliminary examination of the documents Abigail had provided confirmed their allegations, triggering a broader investigation into Neptune Shipping's operations nationwide. Frank was transferred to the Coast Guard vessel, which would transport him directly to the mainland for emergency medical treatment. His condition was serious but stable. The medics reported his age a concern, but his underlying toughness providing reason for optimism. As the various vessels prepared to depart Quarry Island, Griffin found Abigail standing at the water's edge, watching the rising sun illuminate the mainland shoreline where Port Haven lay just beyond view. "It's over," he said, joining her. "Reynolds is in custody. Frank will recover. The truth about our father's deaths will finally be known." Abigail turned to him, her expression a complex mixture of emotions, relief, lingering, grief, and something warmer that caught the morning light in her sea-blue eyes. "Not over," she corrected gently. "Just beginning differently than we expected." Griffin understood her meaning immediately. The resolution of their father's deaths didn't represent an ending, but a new starting point for justice for Port Haven's future, and perhaps for something between them that had grown from reluctant alliance to genuine connection during their shared ordeal. "Port Haven will need to adjust to some changes," he acknowledged. "Neptune's presence in the harbor, the revelation about Reynolds's crimes, the federal investigation that will continue for months. And Harborview Inn will still open on schedule," Abigail added with determined optimism. "The restaurant's renovation is nearly complete. Chef Laurent's menu is finalized. Life continues alongside justice." Griffin found himself smiling a rare, genuine expression that transformed his usually stern features. "I believe I was promised an invitation to the preview dinner." "You were," Abigail confirmed, returning his smile. "Though perhaps we could arrange a private preview before the official event. I hear the view from the dining room at sunset is particularly spectacular." The Coast Guard vessel's horn sounded, signaling their imminent departure. As they boarded, Griffin took a final look at Quarry Island, the site of danger and revelation that had forever altered his understanding of the past and his vision for the future. Samuel Mercer and James Winters had died pursuing truth and justice, their legacy living on through their children, who had finally uncovered the facts of their deaths and ensured their murderer would face consequences. Frank Calloway had found redemption for his long silence. His courage in the quarry balancing the scales of his earlier fear. And Griffin himself had discovered something unexpected during this journey toward truth, that sharing power and purpose with someone like Abigail didn't diminish his strength, but enhanced it, creating possibilities he had never considered when maintaining solitary control over his carefully ordered world. As the vessel pulled away from Quarry Island, Griffin stood beside Abigail on the deck, their shoulders touching lightly in silent acknowledgement of all they had shared and all that might lie ahead. The morning sun caught in her auburn hair, gilding it with light as they faced toward Port Haven and the future that awaited them there. The tide of redemption had risen, washing away decades of secrets and setting a new course for all whose lives had been touched by the long-submerged truth of the Trident and the Atlantic venture. What came next would be built on foundations of justice rather than deception, a legacy worthy of the fathers whose courage had set these events in motion 25 years before. Griffin Mercer, who had spent his life controlling his environment to prevent the chaos of loss, found himself embracing the uncertain possibilities that lay ahead, not with fear, but with the quiet confidence of a man who had found something worth the risk of vulnerability. Not possession, but partnership. Not control, but trust. Not isolation, but connection. The sea that had taken so much from him had in its time returned unexpected gifts. As Port Haven appeared on the horizon, Griffin knew with certainty that the harbor of his heart had finally found its true anchor.